This story began a long time ago with the rescue of a little boy. The boy ran away with his sister and asked her to wait for their parents. The girl continued to run, trying to calm him down, even though she was in tears herself, and said that their parents would definitely catch up with. Hearing that their parents would catch up with them, the boy did not believe his sister. A huge tear rolled down from the inner corner of his eye, and he turned to the girl. He saw that his parents, like many others, were lying face down on the ground. He asked if their parents were asleep, and, if so, offered to wake them up. Suddenly, there was an explosion behind them, and people with weapons were running nearby. They ran along with the other people, and the little boy cried, calling for his parents and sister. He couldn't calm down. The girl promised to come back for his parents later, asked him to hold on tight so he wouldn't fall, and continued running. Two men with guns were watching them from an ambush. They fired bullets that hit everything around them. The girl crouched down on the ground and held the little boy close to her. The boy was scared, so he kept calling for his sister. The girl asked him not to be afraid, saying that she was holding him and he just needed to close his eyes. Suddenly, a guy appeared in front of them and managed to neutralize the two men sitting in ambush. The girl and the boy continued to sit on the ground. After clearing the way, he put down his weapon and asked if they were okay and hadn't been hurt. He told them to run away quickly because it was dangerous there, but the children remained where they were. And suddenly, something in the sky caught their attention, and that of their savior. They stared at it without looking away. They saw an airplane approaching them at tremendous speed. There was a red star painted on its tail and a huge red circle on its nose. The guy realized that the plane was going to attack and that they were in the line of fire. He rushed towards them, trying to save them, wanting to push them out of the way. The plane began firing at the ground. Explosions began to sound again. Fire flashed here and there, and spray of earth rose into the air and covered everyone. The boy found himself on the ground, sitting on all fours. He was barefoot and crying hard. He didn't know where his parents were, whether they would catch up with them, or what had happened to his sister. Suddenly, a crackling sound caught his attention. He turned his head and saw an iron helmet that had been cracked by the explosions, with several pieces even broken off. He looked around and saw his sister. He called out to her, and she coughed. She was lying motionless on the ground, not far from him, her arms spread out to the sides, silent. The boy realized that something was wrong with her. He began to shout loudly, calling her name. Tears sprang from his eyes again. He was in despair, but it was all in vain. He crawled over to her and began to shake her, shouting for her to wake up and get up, but the girl did not move or respond to him. She was injured. The plane turned around, circled, and approached them again. Suddenly, the girl raised her hand, stroked the boy's cheek, and wiped his tears. She asked him to go ahead and assured him that she would catch up with him, then coughed. But the boy cried out that she was lying and would not return, just like his mom and dad. The baby cried that they were all lying and asked his sister again to get up and go with him. Then he cried loudly, throwing his head back and shouting for help. Suddenly, a guy in uniform appeared in front of him. He seemed huge to the little boy. It was the guy who had pushed them away, only now he was without his helmet. He looked at the boy and said he couldn't even pretend that the child was dead because he was crying so loudly that he was practically drowning out the roar of the plane. The boy looked up at him hopefully with his huge gray eyes, from which tears continued to flow, and asked, "Are you a soldier, sir?" The guy looked down at the kid, told him to stop crying, and added that he could only save him. The child was still sitting on the ground, in the rain, trying to wake his sister and watching the soldier intently. Meanwhile, the plane was approaching, flying so low and so close to them that, if you wanted to, you could see the pilot. The rain continued to fall. Looking closely at the boy, the soldier said in a serious tone that what was about to happen and what the boy would see would be their secret. He raised his left hand with several fingers pointing upward, and a glow appeared. He added that if the boy told anyone, no one would believe him. Then he concentrated, and suddenly, right before their eyes, individual raindrops began to gather into larger ones. They grew and grew until they were the size of peas. The boy stared at the man without looking away. He was still crying, but he had stopped shaking his sister and was watching what the man was doing with curiosity. He saw the soldier raise his hand, join 3 fingers together, and then a kind of glow appeared, followed by individual raindrops gathering into larger ones. Then the soldier moved his hand, directing the drops toward the plane flying toward them, and suddenly streams of water began to rise into the air. They began to attack the flying plane. The pilot tried to shoot back, but he himself had already been hit several times by water bullets, and smoke rose from these places. These drops were even able to break through the glass of the aircraft cockpit. The pilot tried to turn away from them, but in vain. And then he realized that these were bullets made of water droplets. Despite the fact that they were indeed made of water droplets, this did not affect their destructive power. And, as a result, an explosion occurred in the air. The boy looked up at the sky, which suddenly changed color, becoming lighter, and sunlight began to shine through the holes made by the bullets. The guy suggested that the boy, who was still sitting next to his sister, let her go in peace. He took the girl by the hand. She was lying with her eyes closed, but smiling. At that moment, a rainbow appeared in the sky, and the guy said that the rainbow would show her the way, that his sister and parents would get there safely, and that he shouldn't worry. Still sitting on the ground, the boy looked up at the guy with his huge gray eyes, the tears already dried, and asked if he was God. Hearing the boy's question, the guy thought about how to explain it more clearly. He didn't expect to cause such an association and said no. Then the child, still looking at him hopefully, asked if he was a tokebi, meaning a legendary hero who had come to life and possessed eternal life. The guy thought about it, scratched his chin, and said that this option did not apply to him, that he was completely different. The boy sat on the ground, and the guy stood and seemed huge to him. The guy seriously thought about how to explain it to the child in a way that would be understandable and not reveal too much about himself. Then he smiled and said that his name was Dao's. The child was very surprised. He had already calmed down and stopped crying. He was very interested in this guy and said that he was a master. The guy was glad that the kid finally understood him and knew who the Taoists were, and that he had stopped crying. He smiled and said his name was Chong Wu Chi. Nowadays, the events of this story begin with an introduction to DJ Chong Wu Chi, a video blogger who eats on camera and chats with viewers. He went on air and was greeted by his viewers. His peculiarity is that he adds the particle Wu to his greetings as part of his name and image. He broadcasted from his room in front of his computer wearing a blue tracksuit, and the first thing he asked was if everyone had a good day. Many replied that their day had been better, but some were upset that he was wearing a tracksuit again, and John Wu Chi asked what was wrong with it. People started writing to him to throw away the old suit because it was full of holes, but he replied that he couldn't get rid of something that had been given to him as a gift. Some suggested it was a gift from a girl, while others wrote that they would not date him. John Wu Chi stated that it was a gift from someone grateful for being saved. The audience began to say that he was mocking them, and then demanded that he show his magic. And they saw that there was a spider hanging over his shoulder. Someone said that it was the tracksuit that attracted spiders, and Zhang Wuqi pointed his index and middle fingers at the spider. In a moment, the spider was trapped in a bubble of water. The guy turned to the audience and said that there was no magic involved, just the abilities of a Taoist. Some people said it was all computer graphic, some called it magic, and there were those who recommended that he participate in the Bit talent show. Continuing to hold the spider in the trap, and without lowering his fingers, the guy replied that this was not magic, but only martial arts. Suddenly, something went wrong. The guy rushed to check the camera, indignant that everything had shut down again. The camera was out of order, and the spider fell onto the table. Without figuring out what had happened, and without adjusting the camera, the guy was unable to go live again, and he leaned back in his chair in irritation, exhaling loud. He would have sat there, puffing with indignation, but his attention was suddenly drawn to an insistent and polyphonic demanding meow, though it was not unexpected. Changguchi turned his head toward the window and saw 3 cats sitting on the sidewalk above the room where he was sitting. He called them the 3 Musketeers. Seeing them, the guy remembered with annoyance that he was supposed to buy them food, but had forgotten what he owed them, and he admitted this to them while the cats licked their lips in anticipation. He went out into the street, turned the corner, and, seeing his friends, told them to wait a little while he went to find something tasty for them. Since he didn't have anything suitable for them at home, he had to go to the store, so he went as he was, in his tracksuit and flip-flops. As he walked along calmly, minding his own business, and thinking about what to buy for his wonderful musketeers, he was suddenly overtaken by a black foreign car. The rear window rolled down, and John Wuqi asked the guy sitting in the car why he had come to see them, but the guy asked him to get in the car, adding that he had something to talk about. Zhang Wuqi suggested they talk, and said he knew why the other guy in the car had come, asking why he was still broadcasting. Zhang Wuqi leaned over and said that people liked the show. The guy replied that he shouldn't show his magic, but Zhang Wuqi objected, saying that otherwise, he wouldn't get any likes. The guy in the car replied that he didn't understand the risks of revealing his abilities, and that if he needed money, he should just say so. Zhang Wuqi leaned toward the window and began picking his ear with his little finger. Droplets of water danced around him, which greatly annoyed the guy in the car. A moment later, Zhang Wuqi disappeared completely, leaving behind a circle of water droplets and a huge puddle near the foreign car, with no trace of him left. The guy in the car sighed, propping his head up with his hand, and said it was just a clone, and that it was strange that after living for hundreds of years, Zhang Wuqi still hadn't grown up. At that moment, the guy was in the store, already at the checkout, with 3 cans of cat food and a sausage, the total cost of his purchase being 9 won. The guy at the register was putting his purchases into a bag and said that he recognized him and asked if he was DJ John Wu Chi, as he had just watched his broadcast the other day. The guy smiled back, scratched the back of his head, thanked him, waited for his purchases to be packed, and said that it turned out he was already being recognized on the streets. Meanwhile, the cashier continued, saying that he really liked the show that John Wuqi hosted, but there was one thing that upset him, and the guy asked what it was. The cashier gathered his purchases and said that the lack of a pretty girl ruins everything, and that if she appeared on the air, it could double the number of viewers. The guy thought about it, took the bag with his purchases, and, already at the door, said that his show was actually about Taoist skills. Leaving the store, he came face to face with the girl and immediately asked her where he could find a pretty girl, in case she could give him a hint. The guy was a whole head taller than the girl, and when he looked into her huge eyes, he froze, his own pupils dilating to incredible sizes. The girl also looked at him with her huge blue eyes and, addressing him by name, said that she needed his help. Even though they were acquainted, John Woo-chi did not recognize her. He continued to look at her with surprise, but still not recognizing her, he asked who she was. The girl was holding a document tube in her hands. She opened it and took out a scroll rolled up on 2 wooden sticks, asking if he recognized her now. The girl took out the scroll, which was tied with a bow in the middle and consisted of 2 connected parts, and when the guy saw it, he gasped. The girl breathed a sigh of relief when she saw his reaction and said that it was a relief for her. She asked if he remembered this thing, and he replied, of course, because it was his. Chong Woo-chi seemed happy to see the girl, and that she had brought him his thing, and asked with a smile how Chairman Kong was doing. The girl's face instantly became sad. She lowered her tear-filled eyes, brushed her hair away from her face, and said that Chairman Kong had died several years ago. It was clear that the girl's words had greatly upset the young man. He lowered his eyes, and they too became sad in an instant, and it seemed that the boy was immersed in memories. He remembered how they had met when, after the death of his sister and parents, he had met Khan, who had saved him from death, and he was deeply saddened. They stood near the store for a while, and the girl told him what had happened to the chairman and how he had been living lately. Then they left. They walked on, continuing their conversation. The girl was dressed in an elegant suit and ballet flats, while John Woo-chi walked beside her in a tracksuit and flip-flops on his bare feet. They walked past houses and shops to the boy's house, where cats were already waiting for him, and he thought about how many years had passed since Kong had left. The girl apologized to John Woo-chi for not telling him about Kang's death earlier, explaining that her grandfather had always told her not to disturb him. The fact that she was Chairman Kang's granddaughter was unexpected for the guy, and he asked again if she was his granddaughter, and she replied that her name was Kang Jin-hee. They walked part of the way chatting calmly, but at a turn, they saw a monster jumping from pole to pole, and both were surprised. It was huge and powerful, its eyes flashing with fire, and it constantly bared its teeth. When it saw the guy and the girl, it froze, holding on to an electric pole with its hand. Both were surprised by this encounter. The girl was silent, watching the giant in fear. Jung Woo-chi asked her and himself what it was. Deciding not to linger on the pole, the monster jumped to the ground, tears streaming from its eyes, its mouth bearing huge teeth. The monster was naked. The girl covered her mouth with her hand in horror so as not to scream. John Woo-chi remained calm, but said that the monster looked terrible and dangerous, even at first glance. Meanwhile, the monster did not hesitate. It landed on the ground, screamed, spread its clawed fingers wide, and ran towards the young people. On the way, the monster stopped and struck an electricity pole standing next to it, with such force that it bent. Chong Woo-chi remained calm, but he kept his eyes on the monster, ready to repel an attack or attack himself at any moment. After dealing with the pole, the monster crouched down, leaning on the ground with its hands, and froze for a moment, looking at the young people. The monster's body was a mountain of muscles. It crouched down, still watching the young people, but not moving yet. The guy covered the girl with his arm, stood in front of her, and told her not to stick her head out under any circumstances, but to stay behind him at all times. Suddenly, the monster leaped up, pushed off the ground with its feet, and rushed toward them, spreading its clawed paws to the sides, growling and baring its teeth. However, John Woo-chi remained calm. He slowly put the bag of groceries on the ground and decided not to rush, but to wait until the monster came closer. The monster moved with lightning speed, but John Woo-chi remained calm, thinking what a big, strong guy he was. At that moment, the monster threw its head back and growled menacingly, its eyes still burning with red flames. It bared its teeth, and for some reason, tears flowed from its eyes. Waiting for the monster to approach, John Woo-chi put his left hand forward, pointing it at the monster, and energy flows swirled around it. When the monster was a few meters away from the guy, something unexpected happened. He suddenly found himself in a huge bubble of water that held him back. Having immobilized the monster in this way, John Woo-chi froze the water and struck it in the head with his left hand, hoping to knock it unconscious. The ice did indeed immobilize the monster for a while, but its eyes still sparkled. Its huge teeth were bared, and the monster was enraged. Chong Woo-chi decided that he had dealt with the monster very easily. He yawned as if bored and reached for his phone, intending to take a picture of it. However, it wasn't that simple. The monster began to move. The ice on its face cracked. It growled. Saliva flew from its mouth, and the guy was surprised. This was very unexpected for him. He continued to hold the phone in his hands, but thought that the monster he had encountered was very unusual. However, apart from its head, the rest of the monster's body was encased in ice, so it continued to rage, its eyes flashing and saliva spraying in all directions. Standing in front of the monster with a bored look on his face, John Woo-chi teased him, taking advantage of his immobilized position, and told him to try a little harder. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came to him. He thought, why not film everything that was happening and see how many likes such a video could get him? He turned to the girl, threw her his phone, and she barely managed to catch it. He asked her if she had seen his broadcasts, and she replied that yes, of course she had. Smiling, he told her to film everything in the action genre, so she needed to try to capture literally every frame. The girl was a little confused. She understood how crazy what was about to happen was, but said she would try to do everything. After settling all the issues with the filming, John Woo-chi turned to the monster frozen in ice, unzipping his jacket and saying that now it was time to deal with it. Watching him, the girl tried to figure out how the broadcast was happening on his phone. She was nervous, but figured it out and said everything was ready. John Woo-chi began to warm up his arms and shoulders. The monster managed to free his hands and knee, but the rest of his body was still frozen in ice. However, he was surprisingly quick to free himself from the ice and, with an incredible roar, rushed towards the guy, who stood calmly opposite him and simply said, "Let's go." Kang Jin-hee was able to figure out the broadcast and start the video. John Woo-chi's fans soon received a notification that he had started a live broadcast. Viewers began to connect, and a monster appeared on the screen, walking towards the guy with flashing eyes. Comments flew in asking what kind of monster it was, and saying that it looked like an action movie. Jung Woo-chi stood calmly, his hands behind his back, waiting for the monster to approach, and said that he was not an expert in hand-to-hand combat. In the comments, people asked if the monster was real. John Woo-chi dodged the attack, jumped forward, and said that the video was a combat action genre. He added that he would try to fight alongside the viewers. At that moment, the monster leaned forward, and the guy, standing above him, kicked him in the head. The monster did not expect such a trick from the guy. He howled, tears spurted from his eyes, saliva flew from his mouth, and people in the comments began to write that it was an amazing place. The monster pushed off with such force that it broke the asphalt and rushed at the guy again. The guy jumped into the air and bowed before him, holding his hands behind his back. In the comments, people asked where this was. Someone replied that John Woo-chi lives in Seoul. He bent down, holding his body on his left leg, dodging the monster's blow. His right leg was free, and he struck the attacker powerfully in the chin with it. While viewers wrote in the comments that this couldn't be true and that it was all fate. The monster was surprised that the guy managed to dodge his blow and strike him back. He howled, and people in the comments discussed which area of Seoul this was happening in. Jung Woo-chi calmly brought his right leg back, standing with his hands behind his back. People discussed that he couldn't live in an expensive area. Trying to recover, the monster stood with his head thrown back. Suddenly, the guy ran up and, still holding his hands behind his back, jumped on his knee. Pushing off his knee with his right foot and left foot, he delivered another crushing blow to the head. The monster certainly did not expect such agility. John Woo-chi landed after delivering these blows and waited to see what the monster would do next. While people in the comments wrote that now the most interesting part was about to be. Kang Jin-hee, who was filming the broadcast on her phone, snorted. And viewers immediately began writing in the comments that they thought they heard a woman's voice. The fight continued. The monster, coming to its senses, rushed at the guy, but he pushed off with his right foot and braced his left knee against the monster's right knee. His hands remained folded behind his back. Pushing off while kneeling, he flew into the air and ended up above the monster. The comments discussed the girl. Being on top and still holding his hands behind his back, John Woo-chi kicked the monster, who fell from his height onto the asphalt, raising a cloud of dust. While the monster was struggling to get up from the ground, John Woo-chi analyzed his condition and thought that he was in pain because he hadn't used his body in a long time. The monster was not ready to lose. Coming to its senses and gathering its strength, it rushed at the guy again with incredible speed, growling and trying to scare him. While the monster was running towards the guy, the spectators were writing questions, and suddenly they saw a kitten running after a butterfly and started writing that it was in danger. The appearance of the cat came as a complete surprise to the guy. Fearing for the kitten, he even unclenched his hands, although he had not done so throughout the entire fight. And while the monster was rushing towards him, growling fiercely, he sent his clone to save the cat. He simply could not allow the animal to be harmed. After making sure that his clone had saved the kitten, John Woo-chi rushed towards the monster, throwing his left arm forward and casting a spell. They barely managed to pass each other. the guy's clone with a kitten in his arms, and the monster, as the guy sent a spell of an icy spear straight into the monster's stomach. Chong Wu-chi looked at the monster and held his left hand out in front of him, from which a white light poured out. And suddenly, sharp pieces of ice began to hit the monster. It roared terribly, tears and saliva still flying in all directions. It was in pain and made sounds like the grinding of metal. A few moments later, its powerful, muscular body collapsed to the ground with an incredible crash right at the boy's feet. The monster was alive. Jun Wu-chi thought he was amazing, moving after 6 blows with Ice Spirit. He should be left alive and taken to the old man. Putting his hands in his pockets and leaving the monster lying on the ground, the guy turned to Kang Jin-hee and asked her if it had worked out well. She replied that it seemed so. Smiling, the guy asked for her phone and asked if he could take a look, and the girl handed him the gadget without taking her huge blue eyes off him. The broadcast was not over. Taking the phone, the guy saw that the fight was happening live, and people were still writing comments and liking it. Seeing that it was live and that a lot of people had watched it, he was horrified, and instead of being happy, he was terribly upset. Covering his face with his hand, he began to shake his head from side to side, repeating that it was a failure. The girl became worried, apparently embarrassed by the guy's reaction. She asked him what was wrong, saying that he usually did the same thing, but the guy continued to shake his head and noticed that the monster was rising from the ground. While they were reviewing the broadcast with Jun Wu-chi, Kang Jin-hee was caught on camera, and viewers saw her and began to write about what a beautiful lady she was. While they were dealing with the broadcast, Jung Wu-chi stood in front of the girl to protect her, just in case, and saw that the monster had escaped and cursed in frustration. His thoughts about the broadcast and the escaped monster were interrupted by a phone call, which was very untimely, so the guy was in no hurry to answer. The phone lit up with a call from an old man. The guy was deciding which button to press to answer the call or hang up, thinking he had messed up. After dealing with the monster, Chun Wu-chi went straight home. He should have returned long ago, because 3 hungry cats were waiting for him at home. And so, he returned home after his adventures, and the 3 musketeers finally got the chance to enjoy their food and get the long-awaited pleasure. And after eating, there is nothing better than stretching out and sleeping, which is what they were going to do, especially since it was evening, and the atmosphere was conducive to it. Kang Jin-hee went with Jun Wu-chi to his house, and after dinner, the cats attacked her. One even climbed onto her lap, and the girl had to pet it. Another one climbed onto Jung Wu-chi's lap, curling up, and she had to pet it too, while he silently glanced at the guy he had seen earlier that day. This guy was also present in the room, sitting on the floor in the lotus position, with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes closed, looking extremely indignant. All 3 sat on the floor in silence, the only sound in the room being the purring of the cats. Each was thinking about something of their own, and no one dared to break the silence. Finally, the angry man began to scold Chun Wu-chi, saying that he had warned him to be careful and not to reveal himself. But he went ahead and showed the fight live. Jun Wu-chi began to justify himself, saying that it was just an accident and that he hadn't turned on the broadcast. But his interlocutor decided that this was no excuse. Still sitting with his arms folded across his chest, he turned to Jun Wu-chi and said that from the very beginning, he had been against the idea of becoming a DJ. Suddenly, behind him, the wall burst into flames so high that they almost reached the top of the door. Jun Wu-chi thought that a Ganyuk should be more careful. At that moment, a gray cat approached them, its eyes burning amber and reflecting the fire of the blazing wall. Behind the angry man, the fire raged, and the cat approached him. He shouted that he had lived for thousands of years, but a guy like Jun Wu-chi, but he didn't have time to finish. Because the gray cat approached him, lay down in front of him on the floor, put her head on his leg, and began to purr. He fell silent and looked at her in surprise. Then it sat down in front of him, placing its front paws on his legs, and looked at him intently, continuing to meow. The guy was still silent. After listening to everything the cat had to say, he picked her up and smiled. The cat stretched out her paw toward him, and Jun Wu-chi, who was sitting nearby, just grinned. Kang Jin-hee, who was sitting opposite them, couldn't help herself either and burst out laughing. She even covered her mouth with her hand so that no one would notice her laughing. It seems that the angry guy understood that it was just a cunning cat trick to make him stop being angry at Jun Wu-chi. He grunted and coughed into his fist. He asked if the girl was Chairman Kang's granddaughter, and she replied that she was, introduced herself, and said that she had accidentally turned on the broadcast. She asked the guy not to be angry, adding that it wasn't his fault, but he stopped her with a gesture. At that moment, Jung Wu-chi called him old man. Ignoring the guy, he looked at the girl and asked what kind of help she needed. The white cat was still sitting in the girl's arms. Next to the girl lay a piece of parchment that she had shown to Jungwoo-chi. It seemed that the girl was about to tell him something, but she began to stutter. Seeing that the girl was nervous, Jungwoo-chi hurried to calm her down, saying that she didn't need to be afraid of the old man because he was much more reliable than he was. The girl replied that she didn't know how to address the guy, so he told her to call him whatever she wanted. Jungwoo-chi advised her to call him old man and smiled slyly. Kang Jin-hee laughed, and this insignificant conversation seemed to relieve all the tension in the room, and she promised to call him senior. She picked up the scroll and said she had found them thanks to him, adding that after her grandfather's death, her family had fallen into decline. The company went bankrupt, and her father had to sell the branches and hide the family property to pay off debts and money for using cryptocurrency. She recalled the state her father was in when he had to do this, and the old man asked how he was able to find so much money if the business was ruined. Kang Jin-hee replied that there were probably those who believed him and lent him money because they saw that he had sold everything he had to pay off his loans. So their family fell into debt bondage. Her mother seemed oblivious to everything that was happening. She reassured her daughter and said that everything would be fine now. At that very moment, the girl's mother fell under the influence of a cult. She constantly reassured her daughter, saying that they had faith, but it didn't help. The guys listened attentively to the girl, and they became increasingly gloomy. Until finally, Jungwoo-chi said that debt is terrible, but obsession with a cult is worse. The girl lowered her head, her eyes filled with tears, and said that her mother spent all her time praying and only came home once or twice a week. Finally, she put the scroll on the floor and said that after her grandfather's death, her father had not touched the scroll, but people had begun to show great interest in it. She added that many people offered a lot of money for it, and she decided to return it before her father sold it. He himself ordered it to be given to the master before it was too late. After telling this, Kang Jin-hee handed the scroll to the old man, who still had a gray cat sitting on his lap. Each of them had a cat sitting on their lap. The old man opened the scroll and said that such excitement was probably due to its content. Jungwoo-chi said the work was excellent and asked what was wrong with it. The scroll contained a drawing. The old man studied it for a while and said that it was full of pretentiousness and looked trivial. Jungwoo-chi said that the buyers were blind because they couldn't see what they were going to buy. The old man nodded thoughtfully as he continued to examine the drawing. Jungwoo-chi suddenly lost his temper, snatched the scroll from the young man's hands, and said that if he didn't like it, he would take it for himself. The young man asked if it was his work. The young man remained silent, and then the old man replied that he had doubts about it, so it was unlikely that there were people who really knew the purpose of this item. Suddenly, Jungwoo-chi asked who was interested in the scroll, and she replied that it was the members of the sect who had taken her mother and those who had lent money to her father. The girl looked down sadly and added that there were also those who said they would pay off her uncle's loans, and they were also interested. Then she hesitated, and the guy guessed and asked if the monster they had encountered that afternoon was also interested. But the girl replied that she knew absolutely nothing about today's monster. She had only encountered it on the way here and had never seen it before. The old man looked at Jungwoo-chi and said that first of all, he needed to find out what the scroll was, and said that the guy surely knew because he had drawn it himself. Then Jungwoo-chi said he would guide the old man and unfolded the scroll on the floor in front of them both so that everyone could see what was depicted on it. Then he stood up and told the old man that his inspiration was the taste of hot mocha and asked what kind of coffee the girl liked. She replied that she didn't need coffee. The guy said okay and was about to leave the room to get coffee, clearly intending to step on the scroll. When he lifted his foot and was about to step on the scroll, a funnel of energy appeared beneath him, but it was not visible from above, only from below. And when he stepped on the scroll, energy began to break through it. But the old man and the girl looked at Jungwoo-chi, and he said he was leaving. They noticed that something was happening when the guy had already fallen into the space of the scroll, and the white cat jumped off the girl's lap and jumped towards him. All she managed to see was the top of the boy's head. The cat began to meow loudly to call him back, but everything returned to the way it was before, and the scroll became as it had been before. The girl rushed after the cat to the scroll, but it had already returned to its previous state, and she never understood what had happened. Meanwhile, the old man remained completely calm. The girl asked if it was some kind of interdimensional door, and he replied that it was possible. Although he appeared unperturbed on the outside, he also had many questions about what had happened, and he was trying to find answers. The girl was confused and discouraged. She shared that in one day, she had seen more than she could have imagined in her entire life. The old man, sitting in the same unperturbed position with his arms folded across his chest, smiled and said that there were things he had not learned even in thousands of years. His answer shocked the girl, no less than everything else that was happening. Looking at him with wide eyes, she asked again, "Thousands of years? Then how old is he?" But the man did not answer. Instead, he said that if she wanted, he could ask someone to watch over her family, not for surveillance purposes, but for protection. The girl lowered her eyes and said shyly that, in her opinion, she had already caused enough problems for Jung Woo-chi, and he was still offering help. But the old man looked at her kindly and replied that she should not worry. No matter what problems she had caused, Jung Woo-chi would surpass her 100-fold. As soon as he said this, Jung Woo-chi jumped out of the scroll, holding 2 cups of coffee in his hands, and indignantly asked if they were talking about him. As the guy climbed out of the scroll back into the room, the old man looked at him seriously and said that he was very perceptive. The guy sat down next to the old man and handed him a cup of coffee. The old man asked where the scroll came from, and the guy replied that he had created it himself. Taking the coffee and taking the first sip, the old man asked how Jung Woo-chi had created this list. He wanted to know in great detail. At that moment, the young man handed another cup of coffee to the girl sitting opposite him, turned his head toward the old man, and said carelessly that he didn't know. The old man looked away from his favorite drink and looked at the guy indignantly. After a pause, he asked if the guy was making fun of him, but Jung Woo-chi just spread his arms and said that it was the truth, that he really had created it himself, but he didn't know how he had endowed it with such abilities. After that, the old man asked the next question. Did the young man have any idea who might want to get hold of this list? The young man thought for a moment. He looked at his friend seriously, and at the same time, somewhat confused, and honestly admitted that he had no idea who might need it. Seeing that there was no point in asking Jung Woo-chi, he began to think hard and told them they would need clues to track down those who were hunting for the scroll. Suddenly, Jung Woo-chi had what he thought was a brilliant idea, which he hastened to share with those present. They looked at him questioningly and waited. He showed them his phone and said with a big smile that the essence of his idea was to start a live broadcast and thus attract the monster. Jung Woo-chi went live, showed the fight with the monster, and announced that he was looking for the scoundrel who had destroyed everything and fled from responsibility. He showed what the monster looks like up close and asked if anyone had seen it to write in the comments. There were many comments, but none were relevant. He showed footage of the fight with the monster over and over again, urging viewers to leave comments if they had encountered it, but they doubted that it was true. The old man's assistant played his video on the internet and asked how Jung Woo-chi could have survived if he was really so powerful and scary. Meanwhile, the guy was watering flowers in his office and consulting with her about what they could do if they couldn't destroy the monster. The girl asked if he thought it was impossible to destroy the monster by separating its head and body, and the guy asked how to do that if it could change its appearance. The girl said that the moment when the monster appeared in the video had been corrected. Civilians who saw the whole wall at the scene of the fight believed it was CGI and left. She wanted to tell him that they had contacted the locals and told them to keep their mouths shut. But the guy interrupted her and asked what else she had to say. The girl checked her notes and said that he still had a meeting today with the secretary of the Ponsan group, Yu Jin. She found information for him about the Kana family, who were much more influential than they thought. And she believed that the collapse of the house was a planned attack. After listening to her, the guy told her to select only those people who were related to the Jung Woo-chi scroll. But the girl said they couldn't do that. This information interested the guy. He turned and asked his assistant if she wanted to say that all members of the Kang family were involved in this. She replied that it would take 6 months for the internal investigation department to obtain this information. Then she handed him a tablet and said it was a letter of approval. The guy asked if they had some thoughts about Jung Woo-chi. He began to read the letter, and the girl said that the Internal Affairs Department thought it might be related to what he had asked about earlier. After carefully reading and signing the letter of approval, the guy thought for a moment and then said that it looked bad, but it was still unclear. Returning the tablet with the letter to his assistant, the guy said that the first thing to do was to investigate the suspicious sect that Kang Jin-hee's mother had joined. The guy thought about the girl's difficult fate and how she managed to get involved with Jung Woo-chi in the first place, then suddenly looked at his phone and was surprised. Staring intently at the phone screen for a long time, he studied the information he had received and then said in surprise that he had helped her at the scene of the operation. Meanwhile, Jung Woo-chi's broadcast yielded no results. But the guy didn't sit still. He searched for the monster around the city, moving from roof to roof. Barely managing to land, he jumped again, holding his hands behind his back and clasping them together, his back completely straight, masterfully maintaining his balance. He received a phone call, answered it while wearing headphones, and was informed that all civilians within a 2-kilometer radius had been evacuated. Jumping between buildings, he marveled at how this could have been organized in the middle of the day. He was told that the area would soon be resettled and that there were few residents. Then the guy asked if it was true that there were casualties among the visitors. They told him that it was true because the lower part of the body had been completely blown apart. The guy was almost back where he first met the monster, and he ended the conversation by adding, "It doesn't matter how well you can fight if you have a lot of enemies." He jumped off the roof of the building and landed on the power line pole where he had first seen the monster, his hands still behind his back. Standing on the pole and looking at the city spreading out below, the guy thought that there was something good for monsters in a crumbling city. He put his hand to his forehead, making a kind of visor to protect himself from the sun, and began to look more closely, trying to see the monster among the buildings. Still standing on top of the pole, he was able to focus his vision so as to filter out everything unnecessary and concentrate on what he was looking for. His efforts were crowned with success. After a few minutes, he realized that he had found what he was looking for, and the distance to his target was about 70 meters. But instead of one monster, he saw two, and thought that compared to them, the previous one looked like a gentleman, and noticed that the monsters were looking for something. He decided it was time to go down, so he took a step forward and jumped off the pole onto the ground, still keeping his balance and keeping his hands behind his back. He landed with incredible ease and grace, landing on his left foot and then carefully placing his right foot on the ground. After landing, he walked toward the monsters with a broad smile, completely calm and confident, telling himself that he needed to check what the monsters were looking for. The monsters did not seem to notice him and continued to explore the area, seemingly searching for something within the area where the young man had spotted them. Chang Wuqi approached them, wondering why the monsters weren't attacking him since he was so close, and suddenly realized that they couldn't sense him. This realization made the guy think. The previous monster had sensed him immediately and rushed to attack, but another thought crossed his mind. Coming even closer to them, the guy saw that the monsters were in some kind of translucent sphere, which meant they could only move within it. He realized that they were surrounded by some kind of field, and it was because of this field that they couldn't see him, and it seemed that they were just moving around in one place, looking for something. This was unexpected for him, and he was surprised to note that even he could sense the field surrounding them only by concentrating hard. The next moment, the guy felt that he was not alone here, and asked the person approaching him from behind if this field was his doing. A young man with light hair and a light-colored suit did indeed approach Chang Wuqi from behind, but he was in no hurry to answer the question. He waited until the guy turned to him, and then asked if he was talking about the field. It was indeed his work. It blocked out sounds and vision. Having said all this, the guy decided it was time to greet Chang Wuqi. He smiled slightly and asked if they could have lunch together. However, Chang Wuqi stood silently, looking at the guy and not answering him. It was clear from his face that he was thinking and trying to understand something for himself. The guy, a little confused, replied that he had heard somewhere that it was customary to introduce oneself in this way in this country, and asked if he had done something wrong. Chang Wuqi replied that this was true, but that this was not the situation at the moment, and thought that perhaps the guy was a foreigner who had not heard that another one had joined them. It seemed that the blonde man had heard Chang Wuqi's thoughts, or read them on his face, so he said that the guy seemed interested in who he was, and called him by name. They stood facing each other, the blonde with his hands behind his back, and Chang Wuqi with his hands in his pocket, and asked how he knew him. He replied that he had seen his stream. The monsters were still in the transparent sphere, and the blonde man added that he was a fan of Chang Wuqi and wanted to see the guy deal with the monsters in person. Chang Wuqi asked in surprise what he meant, and the blonde man replied that he shouldn't worry, that he could get rid of them neatly from here. He touched the gold-plated watch on his wrist, pressed something on it, then winked at Chang Wuqi and added that one of the monsters was on him. Following the blonde man's actions, the guy turned to the monsters and noted to himself that the field holding the monsters was beginning to break down. The field began to crumble from the top of the dome, and it seemed that this contributed to the monsters beginning to sense Chang Wuqi's presence. They began to growl and bare their huge teeth, but the guy calmly turned his head and asked why they were staring at him and called them names. The sphere was almost destroyed, and the monsters were eager to attack the guy. They were already frantic, tears streaming from their eyes and saliva spraying in all directions. When the sphere collapsed, the monsters rushed forward, trying to outrun each other. Chang Wuqi stood calmly, reminding the blonde man of their agreement that he would take one. The guy looked at the blonde standing in front of him, and suddenly, he disappeared in a second. The guy only had time to wonder where he had gone when the monster was already in flight. And at the moment when the monster jumped on him, raising its huge paw to strike, the guy jumped up, keeping his hands in his pockets, thinking, oh well. The monster's huge paw crashed into the asphalt, which began to break into pieces and fly into the air. It was on one of these fragments that Chang Wuqi landed with his foot. Leaning on this piece, he reached out with his other foot and kicked the monster right in the head before it had time to recover from the previous blow. Chang Wuqi remained calm and unperturbed, only taking his hands out of his pockets to make his turn in the air more mobile and comfortable. After completing the turn, the guy slowly landed on the ground next to the monster that had collapsed on the ground. He was a mass of muscles, so he smashed the asphalt beneath him. While one monster was lying on the ground, another one had already managed to run up to Chang Wuqi. It was no less huge and also bared its teeth, growled, and spat. It had a long mane and long arms with claws, which it stretched out toward the guy, but he leaned back, keeping his balance, and avoided the blow. At the same time, The guy had time to think that this monster was quite fast despite its enormous height and size, and he didn't like it at all. He crouched down and jumped back from the spot where the first monster had attacked him. Thinking that these monsters were much stronger than the previous one, a brilliant idea came to his mind. He decided that the monsters should be separated first, so it would be easier to fight them, and he started to run. They chased after him, and the guy suddenly jumped up sharply near the building, his hands still behind his back. The four-armed monster rushed after him. The guy ran along the wall, pushing off from it, even though it was vertical. The monster kept up with him, aided by its four-clawed arms and tenacious legs. Another green monster remained on the ground, raising its head to watch them, and the guy thought that with its huge fists, it couldn't keep up with them. But just as he thought that, the monster threw back its head and roared so fiercely and so loudly that its roar could probably be heard throughout the city. When the roar sounded, the guy was already on the roof and didn't hesitate. Literally a few moments later, the four-armed monster was on the roof. Without thinking twice, Chong Wu-chi rushed forward, jumping from building to building, leading the four-armed monster away from his companion with the huge fists. He had a slight advantage, having reached the roof first, so he jumped to the neighboring building, also staying ahead of the monster for a few seconds. However, the monster was not far behind. It tried not to lose sight of the boy, growling and waving its arms, trying to close the distance between them as quickly as possible. On one of the roofs, Chun Wu-chi decided to jump down instead of running further, and the monster immediately rushed after him, clinging to the walls of the building with its huge claws. Its huge mane fluttered. Its eyes burned with fire. Tears flowed from its eyes. Saliva splattered in all directions. Its teeth were clenched tightly, and the monster growled angrily. Jumping down, Chun Wu-chi flew backwards, and when he saw that the monster was jumping after him without hesitation, the guy raised his hands to cast a spell. Stretching out his right hand, he conjured an icy spear, and immediately, small but sharp icy spears rushed at the monster from all sides. However, completely unexpectedly, the monster began to catch them with both hands, continuing to cling to the building and balcony ledges while catching the spears with the other two. By this time, Chun Wu-chi was standing on the ground, watching the monster's actions in surprise. The guy was clearly not prepared for it to be so intelligent. Meanwhile, the monster, holding the ice spears in its hands, approached the ground, moving very quickly and nimbly despite its size. Seeing that his spear trick had not produced the desired result, the boy raised his left hand and began to cast a new spell. The ice spears disappeared, and drops of water began to materialize in the air, gathering from small drops into large ones and increasing in size. A glow appeared around the guy's left hand as he continued to hold it with his fingers spread apart. The drops became larger and larger, and they all grew in size. Then they froze and turned into pieces of ice. John Wu-chi threw his right hand up and cast a spell to turn the ice into buckshot. Immediately they rushed upward in a powerful stream to neutralize the monster, but seeing what was happening, it pushed off from the building and jumped forward. Flying forward a little, to avoid the hail of bullets that could harm it, the monster rushed down, spreading its arms and heading straight for the guy. This time, John Wu-chi did not have time to react. The monster grabbed him by the head with one hand and squeezed tightly, causing the young man to lean back. But then, something happened that the monster could not have expected. The guy's body suddenly dissolved under its hand, first into a body and then into water. When the monster landed on the ground, instead of the guy he had just safely grabbed, there was a huge puddle of water on the ground, and the monster roared. He began to look around in search of his opponent, sniffing, hoping to detect him by smell, and even got down on all fours. He had no idea that John Wu-chi was watching him from the roof of a neighboring building, his arms folded across his chest, thinking about how fast he was catching spears. The guy thought with disappointment that he would hardly be able to take this monster alive, and became even more upset, thinking that he would have to apologize to the old man for this. Turning his head, he saw a blonde man standing on the neighboring roof, with his arms folded behind his back, and asked if John Wu-chi was having fun. Chong Wu-chi decided that he was joking, so he grimaced in response, and indignantly asked if the blonde man was mocking him. The blonde man scratched his ear thoughtfully and replied, asking if the guy was deliberately not using advanced techniques that could kill monsters. Then he suddenly thought about the question and said meaningfully, and then added that perhaps these techniques were the limit of his abilities. Chong Wu-chi folded his arms across his chest and said indifferently that the reason was that he had simply been asked to capture the monsters alive, if possible. Hearing this, the blonde asked why, to which the guy replied even more indifferently that he didn't know, perhaps to come up with countermeasures against the monsters. The blonde man replied calmly that he had the impression that there was a special organization in their country for this purpose. Chang Wuqi asked him if it was the same in other countries, and the guy, still propping his chin with his left hand, replied that it all depended on the place. Then, squinting and cupping his chin with his fingers, he said calmly that Chang Wuqi should be more careful. Chang Wuqi stood with his arms folded across his chest, looking calm, when the four-armed monster reappeared in front of him, growling and ready to pounce on him. It swung its huge paws, and just as it was about to grab Chang Wuqi, the guy stood on the edge of the roof and jumped down. The monster had to turn around and rush after him. The guy seemed to be running up a vertical wall, and the monster crawled after him, clinging to the walls of the building. Then the monster pushed off the wall with all its might and made a huge leap, closing the distance between them and getting very close to the guy. It swung its huge hands at the guy again and was about to grab him, but the guy leaned back, bending his legs, and the monster was left empty-handed again. The monster flew past him. The guy took a few steps along the wall and ended up on the roof, and at that very moment, without wasting any time, began to cast a spell. The monster also ended up on the roof, but he was below the guy, who continued to wave his hands, energy swirling around them, and cast the spell. As a result of the spell, an icy spear was created, with which the guy wounded the monster. The monster fell onto the roof, and the water beneath him froze, but the guy wasn't done yet. The monster lay on a pile of ice and tried to pull the icicle sticking out of his back with his hands, while the guy continued to create a new ice spear. Using all four hands and all his strength, the monster managed to break the ice spear he had fallen on, even though it was very thick. He had already begun to slowly get to his feet. Chang Wuqi stood with his right hand raised, and suddenly a hail of sharp ice spears rained down from above. But that wasn't all. Focusing and clenching his right hand into a fist, the guy cast an ice lightning spell, and everything around him sparkled. The monster did not have time to get to its feet. In addition to the ice spears flying from the sky, there was also a rain of lightning bolts flashing and darting back and forth. It seemed as if powerful streams of water, mixed with ice spears, were pouring from the sky, and as soon as they reached the surface of the roof, they began to freeze. Soon, the entire roof was covered with ice spears, and the water that fell from the sky also froze, taking the form of sharp ice spears. Then, the stream of rain and ice spears stopped abruptly. The guy remained unharmed, standing on the edge of the roof, watching as the monster became covered in ice. When it was all over, he silently looked at the place where the monster had been lying, and thought that it seemed like it was time for him to go to heaven and be reborn. A few moments later, when the ice melted, Chang Wuqi saw that the monster had disappeared, leaving only a huge, dark green puddle in its place. It smelled awful, so unpleasant and pungent that Chang Wuqi had to cover his nose with his hand to keep from feeling sick. At that moment, the blonde man who had been on the neighboring roof suddenly appeared next to the guy and asked if it was his first time smelling something like that, even grimacing. He grinned as he approached the guy and said that he himself already had quite a lot of experience with monsters, and that this was a completely different area. Chang Wuqi, still covering his nose and mouth with his hand and trying not to breathe in the smell coming from the disgusting puddle, asked what this other area was. Instead of answering, the blonde guy started applauding him, saying that the spectacle was just what he needed, and added that not long ago, it had seemed like a real illusion to the guy. Chang Wuqi cheekily replied that the blonde guy said he was glad to meet him and that he had such skills, but the guy replied that he didn't want anything to do with him. The blonde man moved towards the guy and, either accidentally or on purpose, stepped into the puddle left by the monster. Chang Wuqi thought he would have to spend a fortune on dry cleaning. However, the blonde guy didn't even seem to notice that he was standing in a puddle of foul-smelling liquid. Instead, he held out his right hand to the guy, introducing himself. The blonde man was holding a business card in his hand, which he was now handing to the guy. And, as he had promised, it stated who he was and what he did. Chang Wuqi took the business card in his hand and began to examine it. He read that it said, Merlin the Magician, Illusionist, and included a contact phone number. After reading the information on the card, the guy began to shake it in front of him, asking again if he was just an illusionist, that is, just a magician. To which Merlin calmly replied with a smile that this was indeed the case, and that he was very sorry that he had not had the opportunity to show the guy everything he was capable of. Chang Wuqi listened attentively to the blonde man, his hands in his pockets, thinking that he didn't like something about this guy, but he couldn't figure out what it was yet. Hearing Merlin's words that he had failed to show his abilities, he suggested that he deal with another monster. The magician turned around and asked him. They both looked down, where a huge green monster with huge fists was waiting for them. He was eager to get revenge, including for his comrade. Merlin smiled and said that he had indeed forgotten about the second monster. Chang Wuqi thoughtfully bowed his head and waited for the mage's answer. Merlin slowly raised his hand, snapped his fingers, and waves of energy swirled around him. He said he could easily deal with this monster. The monster was tired of waiting. The longer he had to wait, the stronger his anger grew, and the more ferocious he became, growling incessantly. Merlin straightened his right arm and continued snapping his fingers, beginning to cast a spell, while casually putting his other hand in his trouser pocket. The guys watched the monster standing on the roof. After a few moments of magic, the monster lost its head. Junwuchi was surprised and asked how the magician did it. Merlin replied that he couldn't say yet, and that it would be great if his abilities could be recognized instantly, just like Junwuchi's skills. Seeing the guy's confusion, Merlin said that instead, he would tell him something else, and added that monsters were a failed experiment. Junwuchi asked if these failures meant that there were successes, and Merlin replied that he did not have such information, but he had seen something similar in another country. He seemed to return to those events and said that it happened in Ireland. In one day, a village where people peacefully raised sheep disappeared from the map. Hearing the unfamiliar name, the guy rolled it around on his tongue, tried to pronounce it, and then thoughtfully asked Merlin where it was located. Without waiting for an answer, he asked the next question that interested him much more. If the village had disappeared, how did the wizard himself survive? Touching his watch on his left hand, Merlin said that, as the boy had probably already noticed, he had the ability to hide his body. He added that he could do this for as long as necessary, and had done so even when the village collapsed and was buried underground. Hearing this, Junwuchi was outraged, and replied that he should have told everyone the news. But the magician said that people would have thought he was crazy after that. The young man stared silently at the illusionist for a few seconds, trying to comprehend what he had heard, until he finally asked if he had simply left people to die. The magician replied that he was weaker than he seemed, and had begun an investigation. If it had been done on purpose, the organizer should not start destroying everything indiscriminately. He added that he had researched the monsters, which he had learned about from people who had escaped from there and were tired of suffering, but he had not asked the monsters who had ordered the attack. He concluded his story by saying that he did what he could at the time, and then forgot about everything, and did not encounter anything similar until he learned about it. The guy was surprised that the magician had found out about him from somewhere, so he asked where, and the magician replied that it was from recommendations. He had just posted a new video on his channel. He filled the live stream while the guy was fighting the monster, and said he couldn't believe he would see something like this in Asia, especially on a broadcast, and said he was the same. He looked intently into the guy's eyes, and said that an ordinary person was not capable of such a thing. But the guy cheekily replied that he didn't want to get involved with him. Merlin leaned on the railing and said that maybe someone was conducting new tests now, that he might have missed something, but he didn't have any thoughts yet. Junwuchi asked how he could have no ideas when he knew so much about monsters, and the mage replied that all monsters are completely different, and their abilities are also different. The more the guy listened to him, the more questions he had for the mage. He couldn't understand why the mage was saying he knew some things, but not others. He thought about it. Not that he wasn't interested in monsters, but research and mass production were different approaches, and if something went wrong, there would be trouble. Seeing that the guy was lost in thought, Merlin decided to distract him, saying that he had already told him everything he needed to know, and would like to get answers to his questions. Looking at the birds chirping on the wires, Junwuchi told Merlin that he hadn't told him about their lair yet, but the magician replied that he didn't know himself and didn't want to lie. In response, the magician asked him how the guy managed to change his location, and added that he didn't think it could be levitation. The young man wanted to say that he should not talk about his abilities. Then, he decided to ask Merlin a question. Perhaps he was also interested in the scroll. Hearing the boy's question about the scroll, Merlin asked again what scroll he was talking about. It seemed that he was really hearing about the scroll for the first time. Junwuchi snapped his fingers, and behind him, the scroll unfolded. It looked like a black rectangle as tall as him. He pointed at it and said so. After showing Merlin the scroll, the guy watched him closely, waiting to see any reaction on his face that would give him a clue. However, Merlin showed no visible interest in the scroll. He looked at the guy with a direct, open gaze, which aroused suspicion. He became curious about what was behind the guy's back, leaned over to look, and said, "Maybe it's from moving between dimensions," and replied, "No, I don't think so." Then he looked up at the guy with eyes that clearly showed surprise, admiration, and interest, and asked how he did it. Still holding the scroll open, Junwuchi meaningfully raised his index finger and said no, adding that he would remain silent. He looked at the mage, trying to remember his answer when he asked about the monster, and added that they were not close enough yet, which seemed to be what he meant. When the fight with the monsters was over, Junwuchi went home and went on the air. It lasted more than an hour, and people discussed what had happened in the comments. While the guy was opening a can of soda, those who had just joined the broadcast asked what had happened, and those who had been there from the beginning explained and gave their assessment. When the can was finally open, Junwuchi took a few sips with relish, continuing to follow what viewers were writing in the comments. Having quenched his thirst, the guy put the soda can on the table and said he had planned to explain everything to them, but they had already jumped to conclusions. He added that one person couldn't do anything and asked if they knew how many research centers there were in Korea. People started writing that they knew, Putting his foot on the chair, the guy told him to get it out of their heads and added that the girl who was recording last time was in danger. People began to ask who the girl was. Assuming that the producer and the guy asked what was wrong, why was it strange for them that someone could stream with him? He started to get angry at the commenters. His left hand began to shake, and he said that none of it mattered, that he couldn't come to their house to calm them down. People wrote that they wanted to take a photo with him. Someone wrote that he had his own CGI team, but the guy got upset and started saying that it wasn't true. Someone wrote that the atmosphere on the air today was completely crazy, and Chunwoo-chi clearly agreed with him. Everything today was somehow not going according to plan. Suddenly, someone in the comments asked if he had a video with the informant, and others picked up on it and started writing that yes, they needed the video. Chunwoo-chi was already getting seriously angry, fed up with these empty questions. He grabbed the table, and someone wrote, "Look, he's going to hit the table." Instead of hitting it, the guy raised his hand to a can of soda, and the liquid inside began to rise. People started writing and asking what it was. Meanwhile, the drink kept rising and began to take the form of a monster made of liquid. People started writing that it was a hologram. The angry guy showed them this monster made of soda. He held it with his hand and told them to look, saying that this is what they call a zombie. With his other hand, the guy began to create a second figure out of the liquid, saying that this was the one who told him that zombies were a failed experiment. In the blink of an eye, he formed a person out of the water who looked exactly like Merlin. People wrote with admiration that the modeling was magnificent. Suddenly, he saw someone ask in the comments if the second figure was Merlin, and the guy asked if the commenter knew him. People began to respond that, of course they knew him, because he was the famous wizard, the white magician Merlin, who had taken over Ixid that day. The guy heard about Ixid for the first time, was surprised, and asked the commenters to explain what Ixid was. Someone wrote that the guy should Google it. The figures on the table remained standing without his help, and he scratched his head and asked how it was read. Someone was able to explain that Ixid is an Anglo-American streaming platform where streamers are invited and they have a prize fund. Someone remembered that the winner of the first season was an adventurer and was given access to dangerous places, so they also gave him all the necessary equipment. Chunwoo-chi suddenly became noticeably sad, threw the little man from the soda can off the table right onto his trowel and said, "So that's how it is." Then, pointing his index finger at the second figure of Merlin the wizard and preparing to knock it off, he asked if the winner was a foreigner. People replied that this was indeed the case and warned him that if he started advertising Ixid, he would be banned from the platform where he posted his videos. Annoyed, he threw both figures off the table, splashing his tracksuit, and said, "Well, okay." But they asked him to show them something else. Completely saddened by the bad news, Chunwoo-chi sat with his cheek propped up on his hand and asked in a hopeless tone what exactly they wanted him to show. His mood changed dramatically, and he asked if they really wanted to see him. Someone replied that they wanted to meet not him, but the female producer. Someone else in the comments advised him to go on a tour around the country and show it in his videos. The guy latched onto this idea and thought about it for a moment. Then he leaned over, as if trying to find something under the table, stuck out his tongue, tilted his head, winked, and seemed to be about to do something mischievous. Smiling, he took his scroll from under the table, showed it to the camera, and said that he had something else very interesting for them today. Then he got up from his chair, walked over to the door, unfolded his scroll completely so that everyone could see it, and showed it to the audience. Smiling, he asked them to write in the comments where in Korea they would like to go. Someone wrote that they would like to go to the moon. People didn't understand what was going on and why the guy had taken out the scroll and was asking such questions, but he asked the commenters to be more serious. In the next comment, someone wrote that they would like to go to the top of the Namsan Tower. Chunwoo-chi replied that there was no place he couldn't go. People started writing in the comments that it was all a lie, that the guy was deceiving them, but he put the scroll on the floor and picked up his phone to show them everything. Then he turned the phone camera on himself and smiled, saying that they shouldn't ask him to do that on the next stream. Someone wrote, "Come on already." 7,500 viewers froze in anticipation as the guy lifted his foot over the scroll spread out in the middle of the room. The guy stepped on it and fell through. Everyone saw the glowing rectangle of the scroll lying on the floor and the magical space where the guy had fallen. Sitting in front of their computers, viewers couldn't believe that this was really happening. The broadcast continued, and there was no doubt that this was real. Right in mid-flight, Chunwoo-chi smiled, turned the camera towards himself, and asked if everything was okay, if the broadcast had stopped, and if anyone was writing that they were scared. The flight continued, and the guy kept filming everything around him. He was still in the magical space, and said they had to wait a little longer. A few minutes after he stepped on the scroll, he was about to land and happily said, "The top of the Namsan Tower," just as they wanted. However, something went wrong. The guy was indeed flying towards the tower, but the trajectory of his flight shifted slightly, and he was not supposed to land on the tower. Since the broadcast was still ongoing, Viewers saw his eyes wide with horror and his hair blowing in the wind, and they could clearly hear his piercing screams. The guy was flying down. Someone wrote admiringly that he was flying. Someone asked if he was falling by accident, and the guy was getting closer and closer to the ground. The viewers watched the broadcast and his movements without looking away, and the guy flew down without slowing down, thinking that it wouldn't be long before he died. Since the broadcast was still going on, John Woo-chi wanted everything to end spectacularly, and the viewers to be impressed. So, he began to ask, "Come on, open up faster." At that moment, he addressed his scroll, asking it to open in the right place so that he could land safely. The scroll safely opened right in front of him, and John Woo-chi breathed a sigh of relief, not forgetting to film everything that was happening on camera. A few moments later, he safely fell into the rectangle of the scroll and found himself back in the magical space. When he met Merlin and showed him the scroll, Merlin asked if it had accidentally come from there with Mr. Monster. The guy replied that it definitely had it, because he had made the scroll himself, which surprised the magician quite a bit. He asked if it was really him and how he had done it. Chung Woo-chi thought for a moment and replied that he himself did not know the answer to that question, as he had only managed to do it once in 500 years. Then Merlin told him that it was not some kind of unique ability, but an artifact, and that he might agree to sell it for a decent amount of money. The young man replied without hesitation that the answer was no, and the magician asked what he thought about a commission for producing similar artifacts. Chung Woo-chi said he wasn't interested. Lately, there had been a lot of people curious about the scroll, and he raised his fingers to get him to focus. Looking at the mage, he said that he had encountered the first monster after using the scroll, and if the mage knew anything, the guy would share the secret of how to make it. The mage closed his eyes regretfully and said that he had encountered this artifact for the first time, so he had nothing to say, but if he found out anything, he would pass it on to him. Chung Woo-chi remained silent in response to the remark, thinking to himself that if he managed to get information from even one piece of paper, he would be grateful. As he flew to the tower, he had time to think that with the help of the scroll, he could go anywhere. But now, he could not leave Korea. He also thought that he could try to go somewhere further away, but that would be very risky because it could cause complications with the subspace. As he approached the room, he thought that if an ordinary person picked up the scroll, nothing would happen to them. But someone like him could get lost in space. Finding himself in his room and unprepared for landing, he fell face down on the floor and wondered why everyone was so eager to get their hands on this scroll. The next day, Kang Jin-hee dragged him outside. The guy walked reluctantly, looking miserable, whining the whole way that he didn't want to go anywhere. But the girl was adamant. She looked at him with a smile and said that the old man had said it was necessary, and the boy couldn't deny it, so they had to go. Jung Woo-chi was forced to admit that the old man had indeed told him to go. He looked at the girl and said that her outfit had given him strength. As they walked down the street, the men sitting in the cafe turned to look at the girl, but she was embarrassed by the boy's words and said he was flattering her. She really was very beautiful today, and even Jung Woo-chi couldn't help himself and said that it was very pleasant to have a bright young girl by his side. He was wearing a tracksuit and flip-flops and said he had called her to come with him, so there might not be enough salt today. The girl asked again, and he confirmed it. As they walked, the girl asked what the old man did for a living, and the guy replied that he was the chairman of the Ponsan Real Estate Corporation Group. Hearing this, the girl picked up her bag and suddenly exclaimed indignantly that if that was the case, she should have brought something else instead of a roll. Chung Woo-chi did not understand her reaction to the information about the old man and the gift, and asked what she should have brought. The girl replied that she should have brought something alcoholic. After listening to her, the guy laughed sincerely and waved his hand, saying that people like them just need to breathe and she should get it out of her head. In response, Kang Jin-hee asked in surprise if there were others like them. The guy replied that of course there were, and the girl asked how many there were. The guy said there were many, and the whole world would know about them, but the master keeps Korea closed. The girl asked if it was probably so that people wouldn't find out about the others. The guy replied that he probably thinks that if people like him start walking around the world, innocent people could get hurt, so it's important to prevent harm. So they walked and talked until they came across a white foreign car parked near the sidewalk. As they passed by, Jung Woo-chi looked at it. When they reached the car, a tall girl in a white suit with short hair suddenly got out of it. It was the old man's secretary. She greeted the young people, and Jung Woo-chi asked if she was from the Yu family because her face looked familiar. The girl introduced herself. She said her name was Yu Jin-ah and that she was the secretary of the chairman of the Ponsan group of companies. The guy replied that their family had had the same face for the last 500 years. However, the assistant did not respond to his remark. She greeted Kang Jin-hee, and the guy asked if it seemed like generations had been taught to dislike him. She opened the back door of the car, bowed, and said she had heard many stories about him as a child, that she was not ignoring him, and invited him to sit down. Jung Woo-chi and Kang Jin-hee sat in the back seats of the car, and after a while, the foreign car took them to the Tanggung residence. As soon as they entered, Yujin grabbed a bowl of salt and started throwing it at Jungwoo-chi. He shouted that they hadn't seen each other in so long, and she immediately started throwing things at him. A powerful woman standing next to Kang Jin-hee shouted that it was an ancient tradition to purify bad things that were brought into the house with salt. Kang Jin-hee looked up in horror at the woman, who was a whole head taller than her, and asked if she should be sprinkled too. The woman turned to her, looked at her seriously, and replied that since she had come with Jungwoo-chi, she would also have to be sprinkled. The woman looked at the girl seriously for a while, watching her reaction, then suddenly laughed loudly and melodiously, which greatly puzzled her. She said that Jungwoo-chi had recently come into contact with something unclean, referring to his fight with the monster, and therefore he needed to be thoroughly cleansed with salt. After that, the girl dared to say that, as far as she remembered, the god of the hearth, Choven, was associated with the kitchen, and asked the woman if she was by any chance that very Choven. The goddess looked at her and said that was indeed the case, and the girl added that it was customary to leave rice and flatbread for this god, which her grandmother sometimes did. After listening, the woman replied that she was already very tired of these flatbreads because she couldn't stand them, and the girl, embarrassed, covered her mouth and apologized. The woman looked at her and said that everything was fine, that she had nothing to do with sacrifices, and that she should only be in charge of the houses. The girl objected that she was a goddess, but the woman replied, watching as they generously sprinkled salt on Jungwoo-chi, that she could not be called that because she had lived in the world for a long time, just like him. The woman replied that it didn't matter. Because of her abilities, she had many different names, and she asked the girl's name. The girl replied that her name was Kang Jin-hee. After getting acquainted, the woman laughed sincerely and said she was sure the girl would like the boring Tanggung more, as he was polite, unlike Chunwoo-chi. The girl was surprised to hear this name, watching Chunwoo-chi grimace as he was sprinkled with salt, and asked if the goddess had really said the name Tangun. The goddess replied that he was the master of the house and that she had come to see him, but she was acting as if she had heard the name for the first time. The girl replied that it was true, she was hearing the name for the first time. Their conversation was interrupted by Chunwoo-chi, who said that it was unfortunate because the girl did not know the master's secret, and they even stopped sprinkling salt for a moment. The goddess was surprised. She folded her arms across her chest and asked why there was such secrecy and whether the master was planning to marry again. But then the Lord himself appeared. He had heard the conversation on the street as he was walking towards them and answered the goddess's question in the negative, saying that he was not going to marry. After that, the four of them went into one of the rooms, and the goddess said she thought something had happened. If the girl was not a bride, why hide her identity? He turned and asked her what good it would do her to prevent him from marrying. The woman smiled and said that it was fun, as she didn't often get to tease him. Listening to their argument, Jungwoo-chi was frankly bored, propping his cheek up with his hand. So he decided to ask directly why they had been called and asked them to explain quickly. The gentleman looked at him and said they would discuss contributions to the children's entertainment industry and what he was thinking when he showed the scrolls in the stream. Jungwoo-chi turned to look at Tangun and was extremely surprised to learn that he had been watching his stream. Everyone at the table froze, waiting for the continuation. The guy looked at Tangun with admiration and asked, without taking his eyes off him, if he had really watched the entire 2-hour stream. He replied that it didn't matter at all, since the scrolls weren't a tool for attracting attention, and besides, the guy had shown everyone how to use them. After listening to him, Chungwoo-chi replied that he did it on purpose because he had an idea, and if you listen to him, he is truly evil incarnate. Then the guy added that they should wait and see what they could learn from the scroll, because the broadcasts were open to everyone, and that's how they would find him. The man sat with his arms folded across his chest, looked at the guy, and asked if he understood the danger and was still acting irresponsibly. Chungwoo-chi smiled and said with a hint of arrogance that he had fought monsters, and if the gentleman wasn't bothered by it, he could handle even 3 of them alone. Then the goddess joined the conversation and asked who had told the young man that there were only 3 of them, and whether it was the informant he had told everyone about. The guy smiled and said that the informant hadn't said that, and promised that if the monsters showed up, he would bring them here and the goddess could blast them with her fire. Suddenly, the previously calm goddess became enraged. Her eyebrows knitted together, and she shouted, asking if they even realized where they were. Her eyes lit up, fire flared behind them. She laughed and asked Chungwoo-chi if he really intended to bring those filthy monsters into her house. The guy realized he had gone too far, immediately jumped up from his pillow, and began to calm the goddess down, asking her to be quiet because there were people present. However, the secretary seemed quite calm. She had clearly seen many such outbursts during her time at work, so she was not particularly impressed. The same could not be said for Kang Jin-hee. The girl was frightened when the goddess jumped up from her pillow and seemed ready to pounce on Jungwoo-chi. Since the goddess was burning with righteous anger, Jungwoo-chi decided to calm her down. He waved his hands several times, and a wall of water appeared behind him. Then the wave of fire and the wave of water met, and suddenly, without even raising his voice, the gentleman ordered them to stop and immediately remove both the fire and the water. The goddess turned her head and said that he knew the house would not burn down, but he replied that there were girls present, and if she touched them, there would be trouble. Jungwoo-chi decided to be the first to make peace. He stood up, raised his hands in a sign of humility, said he took his words back, and asked the woman to calm down. The goddess calmed down, and immediately the fire went out. The woman folded her arms across her chest, looked indignantly at the guy, cursed him, and called him names. They stood facing each other, and Yujin explained to Kang Jin-hee that Chovan takes his home very seriously, and that it is better not to joke about it. The goddess looked at the girl and said that she could not hurt innocent people, and apologized if she had frightened her. The girl replied that everything was fine. Tanggung asked if he was going to use the scroll on the streams, and the guy confirmed and offered to show a list of people who wanted to meet him. Chovan was not happy with this news. She exclaimed that it seemed this world was beyond saving, and that the guy had even managed to compile a list. Jungwoo-chi decided that this was his moment of glory, and said, "Didn't the goddess know that he was very popular, which is why he was able to bring a girl with him today?" After listening to him, Tangun said that since they had brought it up, if possible, Kang Jin-hee should not walk alone for a while. Looking at the girl, he said she would need to contact Gina, and they would assign people to her. After a pause, he added, "At least this fool, just in case." The girl looked up at him with her huge blue eyes, and asked if not going alone meant that she couldn't even go to the store by herself. In response, she heard that she shouldn't go anywhere alone. The girl looked at him questioningly. Jungwoo-chi asked what was wrong, why he was being so strict with her. Gina explained that, apart from the monsters that had been appearing here and there lately, the master had lost contact with everyone he was looking after. Jungwoo-chi suggested that people were traveling, and that he wasn't going to die just because he was dealing with monsters. Gina replied that there were 20 people. The guy didn't expect to hear that number, and the girl confirmed that 20 people were missing, and that they were just like Jungwoo-chi. The guy replied that the situation seemed strange, and asked how it was connected to Kang Jin-hee, and they both turned to Jin. Now everyone turned to Gina, and the girl lowered her eyes and said that they were linking these disappearances to the Kechong sect. Then she added, looking at Kang Jin-hee, that there was a possibility that Kang Jin-hee's mother was involved with the cult she was obsessed with. The girl felt uncomfortable sharing all these details in front of Kang Jin-hee, so she apologized at the end of her speech. The goddess was just as surprised as Jungwoo-chi and Kang Jin-hee, and the guy thoughtfully said that something strange had been happening in this world lately. Meanwhile, Gina put a map of Korea on the table and said that after the investigation began, they had absolutely no leads for a whole year. The girl continued. About half of those people had disappeared, and their internal investigation department had found many points of intersection between cultists and incidents. Tangun replied that an investigation was necessary, apologized for not being able to say more, but warned of the dangers and asked them to stick together. Then he raised his head, looked intently at Kang Jin-hee, and asked the girl if her mother had returned home. The girl's face darkened, and she said that her mother sometimes returned and was angry when she found out that the scroll had been returned to Jungwoo-chi, saying she would pray harder. After hearing all this, Chovan said that now that the scroll had been shown on the stream, the girl was in the greatest danger. They all remembered the moment when, during the stream, Jungwoo-chi unfolded the scroll and asked viewers to choose where he should go. The goddess added that even if the scroll was not in his possession, his enemies would still think there was a way to get close to Jungwoo-chi. Gina said to Kang Jin-hee that they would definitely assign people to her parents for their safety, and the girl whispered her thanks. But suddenly, the girl turned to look at Gina and asked if the missing people had the same unusual abilities as Jungwoo-chi. After listening to the girl's question, Gina closed her eyes and replied that yes, all the missing people were beyond the laws of their world. In response, Jungwoo-chi smiled broadly and narrowed his eyes, asking if he was the same. And without waiting for the others to answer, he answered himself, only a little. Gina added that, like Jungwoo-chi, these people do not stay in one place. They wander around, and when their appearance does not change, it is easy to become suspicious. She added that at first glance, there was nothing unusual about the disappearances, but in such a short period of only 2 years, dozens of people had disappeared, which had never happened before. Hearing this news, Jungwoo-chi said that now he understood why he had been called so often lately, and Gina confirmed this. The guy was still impressed by the number of missing people and said that if they had told him everything at once, he would have understood everything. Tangun objected that the guy was not the type to just listen and if it weren't for the girl, he would have wandered around and then disappeared without a trace. Chang Wuqi also objected in response, asking why he had dismissed the idea that he would definitely disappear. The gentleman spoke as if he did not know his abilities. The gentleman looked at him, his eyes full of sadness, and said he was sure those 20 people disappeared because they were worse than the guy. These words flattered the young man, but he was surprised once again that day and decided to ask the gentleman who exactly had disappeared. Tengen replied that among the 20 others who had gone missing, he could name Che Udo, and the image of the man immediately appeared before the young man's eyes. The guy was surprised again and said that they had once drunk together and that he was the one who had gathered an army of partisans after the Japanese invasion. Tengun was indignant that the young man considered him a friend but did not know that he was missing. Zheng Wuqi replied that meeting and drinking together was called drinking buddies. Looking at the map, the guy asked if he worked for the Lord, and he replied that until recently, he was the leader of a special task force under his command. Zheng Wuqi, as if plunging into memories, replied that Che Wudol was quite strong, and even though he was weaker than him, he was a real strong man. Since Kang Junhee had no idea who they were talking about, she decided that the internet would help her, and quickly began searching for information about this Che Wu-do. The internet revealed that he was an outstanding commander of the volunteer army during the Imjin War, and Jin confirmed that it was indeed him. Then she laughed and added that according to history, he had died long ago. Kang Junhee, not believing her eyes, asked how that was possible. Gina looked intently at the girl, then at Zheng Wuqi, and replied that the guy was also with them now, in good health, so she couldn't help but agree. Tengen continued, saying that Che Udo had recently disappeared and that the boy and girls were also in danger, so he wanted to call everyone together to report on the situation and ask for help. After listening carefully, Mr. Chang Wuqi smiled and said in a fawning tone that there was no one else who listened to the master better than he did. At this point, the goddess couldn't keep quiet. She clicked her tongue, grimaced, and said that he was a 500-year-old child who had practically lost his mind. The guy, of course, did not leave this remark without comment. He made a grimace in response and asked if his friend would never calm down. The woman immediately went into battle mode. Her eyes lit up and fire flared behind her back. She replied that if the boy continued to bother her, she would roast him. Watching their latest spat, Tangung said that if Chun Wuqi was so obedient, he had something to tell him and ordered the boy to follow him. Unexpectedly, the boy suddenly became frightened. He turned around and asked him to follow him. It was one thing to argue with the goddess, but it was another to go with Tengu. However, the master did not listen, gave the order himself, went first, and immediately raised his index finger, signaling him to follow. Chang Wuqi did not test his patience and followed him. And for some time, they walked along the estate on a path paved with huge stone slab. The young man couldn't walk in silence for long, so he turned his head toward the master and said that he was frightening him and should quickly tell him what he wanted to say to him alone. Tengu looked at him for a long time and said that he needed to know how much of what the young man was saying on the streams was true. But the young man asked him what he meant. The gentleman continued, saying that he was asking the young man about his informant, since he himself had told everyone that a foreign magician had approached him. Zhang Wuqi looked thoughtfully at the gentleman. He still didn't understand why he was asking about the informant, and was thinking about how to answer. They stopped. The gentleman folded his arms behind his back and, looking at the guy again with a long gaze, asked if that was what they were talking about, or if he was wrong. The young man looked at Tangun in surprise, and replied that he had told everything he knew about it. He himself had doubts. He did not like the magician very much. Then Tangun asked him if it was true that he hadn't made anything up in the middle of the story, and that the information about the disappearance of an entire village in Ireland was the absolute truth. The guy thoughtfully looked up at the sky, and replied that it was the absolute truth. He hadn't made anything up in this story, and that the snowball had also told him this information. The next moment, he was struck on the back quite unexpectedly. He only had time to say, "Ouch," Sir said, and the guy told about it on the end. Tears sprang from his eyes. Everything was burning where he was hit. The guy said he didn't know how true it was, but he thought it would be the perfect story for a stream. Everything around him suddenly went dark. The gentleman's eyes turned black. He raised his right hand, and the guy was terrified. He had never seen the gentleman like this before. So he began to apologize and ask for forgiveness, and said that if he had known what he had just heard, he would have called him first. Trying to calm down, Tangun began to slowly rub his temples, and declared that if he suddenly died of anger, it would be Chun Wuqi's fault. Seeing that he was in no danger, the guy laughed again, and, deciding that now was the time for a joke, told Tangun where to go to die. Then he remembered that he had something else to add about his conversation with the magician, and he said that this snowball was called Merlin, and that he was just like them. Tangoon was just about to ask him this question, but the guy beat him to it, saying that this question interested him very much and that he was very curious about it. The guy added that as soon as he saw the gentleman, he immediately wanted to tell him everything, then added that he would not forget if he had to dodge the salt. Tangoon became very interested in this mysterious magician. He wanted to find out as much as possible about him and asked Jun Wuqi what kind of power he had. After thinking for a moment, the guy replied that viewers on the stream had told him that Merlin was a white magician and also said that he was an illusionist. The magician had said the same thing to the guy himself. Recalling the story with the monsters under the impenetrable dome, the guy added that Merlin seemed to be able to block other sounds in a specific range. This fact seemed interesting to the gentleman, and he asked if the guy had noticed whether Merlin's abilities only affected sound or something else as well. The guy began to recall the meeting and said that Merlin does not fight in close combat. His attacks are invisible, and when he blocked the sound, he pressed a button on his watch. He added that Merlin could make a huge hole without moving from his place. Tangoon replied that if his name was really Merlin, he must be very old. He remembered that Merlin's watch appeared much later, and therefore, unlike the guy's scroll, he uses it as a means of concentration. Hearing how much Tangoon knew about the white magician, the guy was surprised again and asked if the magician was famous and why he hadn't heard of him. Tangoon replied that there is an English legend about a queen knight, and it is one of the most famous stories in the world. Perhaps the guy had seen the movie. At that moment, Jun Wuqi lowered his head in annoyance and said that foreign films with subtitles irritated him and that he was far from being a fan of watching them. Tangoon replied that there was also a magician named Merlin in that legend, and it was quite possible that the person who had just contacted the guy was just good at trickery. With these words, the guy handed him a business card with the magician's contact information on it and added that what the magician did was not a trick, but real. Carefully examining the business card with its sparse information, Tangoon asked if the magician's actions were similar to the art of Taoist Chung Wu Chi, to which he replied, yes. Waving the business card in front of the guy, the gentleman replied that Chung Wu Chi possessed a unique and amazing ability to be a thorn in one place. He read the information on the business card again and said that the phone number might be British. He wondered if it worked and if the guy had tried to call. The young man rubbed his chin thoughtfully and said he hadn't tried to call, so he didn't know if the phone number worked or not. And Tangoon asked if the magician had called him. The guy remembered that the magician had promised to call him when he found out something about the monsters and the scroll, and added that he wasn't obliged to call him first. Then the gentleman asked the next question. He asked what the guy had been doing that day, and asked him to describe in detail all the events of the day. He had one more question. He asked why the guy had erased all traces from the scene of the incident. Jun Wuqi was stunned, and even asked again if he had erased the traces. The gentleman replied that he had been told by the Environmental Improvement Department that they had been cleaning up and found many traces of the fight, but all the bodies had disappeared somewhere. Chung Wuqi asked indignantly and a little disappointedly, does the gentleman really think he would waste his precious time on such a boring task? After hearing his answer, the gentleman looked at the young man seriously. He was extremely puzzled by this and asked who he thought could have done it. He looked again at the business card he was still holding in his hands and asked aloud if it was not Jung Wuqi who did it, then it must have been the magician Merlin. Chung Wuqi folded his arms across his chest and replied casually that if it wasn't the magician, then who else could it be? And he didn't think something like this would happen. Without listening to the end, the gentleman interrupted him with a counter question, asking if the guy had even taken the time to monitor the evacuation. Standing in the same carefree pose, the guy replied that if the gentleman had talked to him himself, he would have understood that the wizard had disappeared without even saying goodbye in an instant. Then he brought his face very close to the gentleman's and said that no one knew he would show up, and he didn't suspect that the gentleman would be surprised too. He added that it was impossible to know everyone who was infiltrating them from abroad, and since they had met in such a place, it was quite understandable that the guy was confused. After revealing all this, he suddenly asked how the gentleman's friend was feeling, whether he had recovered. He replied that yes, he had already recovered and was recovering. He added that he didn't know all the details, but it seemed that when the incident happened to his friend, two monsters attacked him at the same time. Chung Wuqi thoughtfully said that it seemed the monsters could communicate with each other, and thought that it was not Merlin's attack, but that it really was monsters. Carefully observing the guy's reaction, and then how he thought about something, Tangoon asked if the guy had any ideas or thoughts on the matter. The guy looked at the gentleman with sympathy and replied that he didn't have any ideas yet. He just sincerely felt sorry that this had happened to his friend. Tangoon said he had to send 2 people to that place right away, and he still had to find the others, make sure they were okay, and ask for their help. Chong Woo-chi asked if the gentleman really thought that the others would want to cooperate with them and offer their help, even considering that the staff was large. The gentleman did not answer this question. He said the young man should go to the Environmental Improvement Department and offer his assistance. This assignment came as a shock to the young man. He asked why he should go there and why they were even talking about it. Ignoring the young man's reaction, the gentleman replied that it would be safer for him now, and besides, he would earn money, which he loved so much. The young man did not like the idea. He said that he would die of stress first, and thought that he did not want to go to that department for anything. The gentleman did not understand the young man's indignation and said that the job was temporary, just to monitor the situation in case something went wrong. But John Woo-chi was already preoccupied with the appearance of his doppelganger. They said in unison that they would go, and that if there were two of them, they had nothing to lose. One suggested surrendering voluntarily to the kidnappers, and the other suggested sneaking in, causing a commotion, and investigating both the monsters and Merlin. They decided that if they got something, it would be good. The gentleman couldn't take it anymore and shouted, and it went in one ear and out the other, and he asked what he was talking about. Returning home after visiting Tanggung, John Woo-chi immediately went to check his email, and not in vain, as something interesting was waiting for him there. Among the large number of letters from subscribers, one caught his attention. The subscriber wrote that he worked in intensive care and that the letter should be read immediately. Seeing the subject line, the guy became agitated and thought that a letter from a subscriber working in intensive care meant that he had a bad feeling about it. He opens the letter. The man wrote about 2 cases he couldn't explain. Cases of patients being saved with wounds that looked like they had been inflicted by wild animals. He also wrote that when these patients regained consciousness in the hospital, they seriously claimed that they had seen a monster and had evidence to prove it. As proof, the subscriber attached a photo to the letter that one of the victims had managed to take, and someone in it really did look like a monster. Chong Woo-chi thought that the victims had told everything, pressed reply to thank the subscriber for the information, and called Yujin himself. The girl picked up the phone and said she was listening to him. The guy replied without preamble that it seemed like there was complete chaos going on there. Since the guy didn't give her any information beforehand and immediately asked a question, she said she didn't understand what he was talking about. Chun Woo-chi, leaning back in his chair with his feet up on the table, asked if the Environmental Improvement Department had made a fuss. The girl calmly replied that she appreciated his concern, that they were already working on it, and that the problem would be solved within the guy replied that he had called to help, and that she was being harsh with him. He refused to work under the old man, but they couldn't allow people to get hurt. The girl agreed that no one should suffer. The guy added that when the monsters appeared, he would deal with them, but this should be kept secret from the old man. When asked how he would do it, the guy replied that if he started working with them, the streams would be blocked, but if the old man didn't know, they would turn a blind eye. The girl asked why he wanted her to ignore it, but the guy told her to stay put and said it would be over soon. She had barely put her phone down on the table when a black, flickering rectangle appeared on the left. The girl even cried out in surprise. Imagine her surprise when, a few moments later, a foot wearing a regular rubber slipper appeared from the flickering rectangle. Then, the smiling Jun Woo-chi himself appeared. He snapped his fingers, the scroll rolled up and disappeared, and the guy exclaimed, looking at the girl, "Just great." However, she did not share his enthusiasm and began to scold him, saying it was disgusting how he could invade another person's personal space like that. The guy asked what personal space she was talking about, if the leader's secretaries had been using the office for generations. The girl asked how he knew that. Chong Woo-chi looked at her with the same smile, his mischievous eyes sparkling. He said he couldn't help but know, as he was the smartest of the old man's protégés. Yujin didn't appreciate his humor and grimaced, but the guy continued, saying that it was the first time he had seen someone so young as her in a leadership position. Now it was her turn to smile. She said that it was absolutely impossible to keep anything secret from the master, just as it was impossible to turn a blind eye to his streams. Jung Woo-chi stood next to the girl and said that no one believed his streams were real anyway, but they were very entertaining. The girl had just opened a letter from a subscriber on her computer that he had forwarded to her and asked if that was the letter he was referring to. The guy replied that he told his friend the truth and asked for help, adding that if he let him know, he would prevent something bad from happening. But the girl interrupted him. She lectured him, saying that it's not so easy for people to accept such things, so now they have to take care of this person as well. Jung Woo-chi folded his arms across his chest and asked in a carefree tone why she always complicates things when there is another, simpler way. Gina replied that his words sounded unconvincing, and that it was one thing when he used magic during the broadcast, but why did he broadcast battles with monsters? Her question caught him off guard. He chuckled thoughtfully, and then said he only did it because his subscribers asked him to. He showed her the app where he posts his videos and said that videos with monsters are in high demand and get more views than those without them. He asked if the old man in Incheon had told her that he had met a crazy guy who watches his streams, and the girl asked if he was talking about Merlin. After listening to the guy and looking at the letter, the girl thought that if at least one of the others saw the video and contacted them, maybe they could save him. A little embarrassed, Yujin said she hoped that if the guy continued to stream, at least it wouldn't be live. Seeing her embarrassment and realizing that he had been given the green light to stream, the guy smiled and said he wasn't as thoughtless as the girl thought he was. So they started working together, and one of their first destinations was a large shopping center in Daegu, where the guy took Kang Jin-hee with him. Yujin gave her final instructions and asked him to avoid causing too much damage, especially to the building, and the guy promised to try. When they entered the shopping center with the help of the scroll, the girl said she thought the center was unfinished. But here, even tomorrow, you could open all the stores. Despite the shops, the shopping center was empty, and the young people walked through it. The guy said that a fortune had been invested in it, and the girl agreed. Chung Woo-chi looked around thoughtfully and said that he had been told to be careful, but he wasn't sure if he could really keep his promise. The girl was shocked by his words. She didn't think their journey would be so dangerous, and asked if he thought it would be possible without destruction. He replied that it would be difficult, but he would try, and that first they needed to find a hiding place for her. The girl asked if she could follow him. John Woo-chi replied that she was crazy, that she only needed to shoot a 2-minute video, and that she didn't need to follow him, just hide around the corner. The girl said that a 2-minute video would require 2 hours of filming, but when the guy asked if she wanted him to fight for 2 hours, she said no. She checked the camera and said the quality would not be very good because there was only emergency lighting, and, after editing, the picture would hardly be clear. They stood on the balcony of one of the floors, and the girl made several test videos. The guy said that Secretary Yu and the others should like it. The girl asked if he was sure about that, and the guy replied that subscribers would complain about the poor quality. She promised to try to edit the video. While she was taking a few test shots, she saw the monster on the lower floor in the camera's viewfinder and hurried to show it to the guy. Without wasting any time, he put his hands behind his back and jumped from the balcony to the first floor, landing as easily as usual and preparing for battle. Looking at the monster, he wasn't thinking about how to defeat it in a fight, but about how many comments there would be and what his subscribers would write to him. At that moment, the monster, which resembled a huge fish with a human body, stood near the glass wall and grimaced as it looked at its reflection. The guy thought that even though monsters are primitive, they seem to be able to communicate with each other, and if they have their own selves. These thoughts led him to wonder how developed their sense of self might be at that moment. And then, the monster screamed. As he screamed, waves of energy began to emanate from his body, and the longer he screamed, the more there were. At some point, the glass in front of him cracked. All these actions were accompanied by a rumbling sound that made Chonuchi's ears ring. He was forced to cover them with his hands, wondering what was happening. The monster stood in front of the glass, continuing to yell at it. The glass shattered into pieces that flew in all directions, but did not harm him in any way. To avoid being hit by the stream of glass shards and getting hurt, the guy hid behind a column and thought that the monster seemed to be having some kind of seizure. The column behind which the guy was standing also took a hit. It tilted slightly, and the guy thought that he couldn't just stand there and watch. Taking a few steps, he came out from behind the column and began to cast a spell, causing a piercing stream of water to swirl around him. As he cast the spell, he closed his eyes, imagining powerful streams of water swirling around his body, and thought it was extremely ridiculous, but the audience loved it. He remembered that on one of his streams, people had written to him that it would be cool to give his spells original names, and promised that the reaction would be great. And now, as he created the spell, the guy thought with surprise and admiration that when an ability has a name, it turns out to be much easier to control. When the monster turned to him, Chung Woo-chi was ready. He put his right hand forward and directed a piercing stream of water at it. However, the guy was disappointed. He hit the monster on the right side, but noted with regret that it remained intact and unharmed, not even wounded. In response, the monster got down on all fours, threw its head back, and began to scream so desperately that the sound could be seen in the form of waves. The sound was disgusting. John Woo-chi had to cover his ears with his hands, and he thought they would fall off. He would rather have fought 100 times with his fists. Covering one ear with one hand, he put the other forward and commanded the spell, Spinning Piercing Stream, then replaced it with a spear. Getting up from all fours and continuing to roar, the monster rushed towards the boy. The sound was disgusting. The monster was huge, only a few steps away. Chung Woo-chi held a long, icy spear in front of him and thought, it's good that the monster is so huge, because as soon as it touches him, the spear will strike it. In a matter of seconds, the monster reached the guy, and the spear was pressed against his stomach. But nothing else happened. The guy did not understand what was going on. The spear did not harm the monster at all, but as it advanced, it was able to reach out with its enormous foot and strike the young man. The monster was twice as tall as the guy, and the blow landed on the upper part of his body. Everything began to sway before the guy's eyes, and then the monster disappeared. Kang Jin-hee, who was filming everything with her camera, was seriously frightened. She was about to rush to the guy's aid, despite the possible danger. But then, completely unexpectedly, he approached her himself. The girl looked at him in surprise, and the guy offered to take her outside. Then she realized that it wasn't Jong Woo-chi himself, breathed a sigh of relief, smiled, and said that she didn't need to go outside, that she was fine. The guy explained that he couldn't use the scroll to take her outside because it was only a copy. However, he could take her outside to the old man and the others, where she would be completely safe and could wait until everything was over. But the girl, looking through the photos she had already taken on her camera, said that she didn't want to leave, which greatly surprised Jong Woo-chi. He asked her why, and added that she shouldn't stay here if they stop filming now. He has no complaints, so she shouldn't be stubborn. He also added that the video they had was enough, that monsters could reappear at any moment, and that they would finish filming sometime later. After listening to him carefully, without taking her eyes off the camera, the girl suddenly shouted irritably for him to stop making her feel useless. Jong Woo-chi realized that insisting was completely useless, and suddenly, they heard the growl and loud cry of the same monster from the lower floor of the shopping center. The girl rushed to set up the camera and prepare to shoot, while the guy helplessly ran his hand through his hair and said that someday she would drive him crazy. Imagine their surprise when a chain of huge ice rocks suddenly appeared in front of them. They both screamed, but the girl continued filming. They were standing on one of the upper floors and saw that the first floor was filled with ice rocks growing upward. The guy asked what it was. Jong Woo-chi looked down at the first floor. The entire space of the first floor was covered in ice. He didn't even know what to say at first, but then he saw something. He saw his double climbing the ice mountains. He was still at the bottom, but moving confidently. The guy shouted, asking what had happened. Using his power, the doppelganger flew into the air and rose at the speed of light, suddenly jumping out in front of the balcony, which even scared Jong Woo-chi. Jumping onto the railing, the doppelganger asked if the guy should be more careful as they almost collided, and Jong Woo-chi asked if it was his doing. The guy asked where the ice in the mall came from, and the doppelganger replied that his attacks weren't working for some reason, so he had to improvise. Shaking himself off, the doppelganger said that today's monster was covered with some strange scales that he couldn't break through for some reason. Jong Woo-chi was very surprised and asked how that could be. The doppelganger replied that he didn't know and had no idea what his body was made of. Looking at the monster below, the guy asked what the doppelganger had done to it. He replied that he had frozen it, and that was the most he could do in this situation. However, the power of his freeze did not last long, and soon the monster began to scream again, even covered with a crust of ice, and the ice slowly began to crack. Hearing what was happening below, the doppelganger added that, in any case, he was just trying to buy them some time, at least a little time. The monster continued its wild roar, and the cracks in the ice became deeper and deeper, covering more and more of the surface of the ice mountains that bound it. Jong Woo-chi offered to take the girl to a safe place, realizing that it was difficult to ensure her safety in these conditions, and she looked at him in surprise. Without even listening to her refusal, he picked her up, threw her over his shoulder, and said that when the monster started moving, she could get hurt. Holding the girl on his shoulder, he jumped up and flew away. He had a plan to ensure her safety and leave the shopping center building through the roof. He climbed with her to the dome of the shopping center, hoping to get her out onto the street from there. And then he wanted to go back and deal with the monster. The girl was lying on his shoulder, upside down, so she didn't waste any time and took advantage of the moment to film everything that was happening below. They climbed higher and higher, and the girl continued to film. Meanwhile, Jong Woo-chi recited a spell, wanting to use the rotation of a piercing spear. Before finishing the spell, he fell silent and looked back down. Their actions resembled an escape from the battlefield, and the guy said it was an incredible shame. He decided that it would be better to call the spell not the piercing spear's rotation, but the water arrow, and he used it, not against the monster. He used all the power of the water arrow to break through the dome of the building so that he and Kang Jin-hee could get out onto the street. The spell worked, and a powerful jet of water picked them up and carried them in a torrential stream straight through the broken dome onto the roof. Once on the roof, the guy immediately ran down the dome. He needed to get the girl to safety and return to the shopping center. Meanwhile, the monster's attempts to destroy the ice cliffs with its inhuman roar were successful, and the ice cracked into pieces, freeing the beast. Once free, the monster threw its head back and watched as Jong Woo-chi left the building with the girl on his shoulder across the roof. Once she was safe, the girl rushed to review the videos she had taken. The guy asked in surprise if she had been filming the whole time. The girl answered affirmatively, and then the guy asked if she was scared when they flew up to the dome and then down the street. Putting down the camera, Kang Jin-hee laughed and replied, "How could she say? They were just flying. It wasn't the building collapsing." They stood at the crack in the roof of the shopping center dome, and the girl asked if she could film from there. The guy replied that he would take her to the camp. Meanwhile, freed from its icy prison, the monster did not wait for Jungwoo-chi to return to it and began to climb the icy slopes itself. The girl continued filming, and when she saw a huge water vortex, she shouted for Jungwoo-chi to be careful. He replied that she was the one who needed to be careful. It was not so much a vortex as a huge ball of water rising from a crack in the dome of the shopping center. Suddenly, the ball froze and then shattered into many pieces that swirled around them. The guy shouted for the girl to run after him. He was in shock and said that the ice was not weak at all. And if the monster had managed to break the ice so easily, he had no idea what it was. Kang Jin-hee watched with wide eyes, but did not stop filming for a second, and the guy thought he couldn't let the girl get hurt. He wanted to tell her to put the camera down, but suddenly, he saw the monster flying toward him through the crack in the dome and jumped up, but not very high, so that when the monster was under him, he could reach it and kick it, which he did successfully. The monster flew into a small house built on the roof from his kick, and the guy wondered what it was made of to break bones and not make a sound. However, at that moment, the guy was proud of himself and even thought for a moment that he had surpassed himself, but the monster quickly recovered. Seeing that it was already trying to get back on its feet, Jungwoo-chi thought that he would like to be able to attack as quickly as the white-haired Merlin. Looking at the monster, the guy smiled and told him that he would beat him until he breathed his last breath, and wondered when he had become so noble. Still smiling, he added that if the monster was left here, there would be problems, but if it was left here, the people from Ponsan would just have to wait a little longer outside. The monster slowly got up and came to his senses. Perhaps Jungwoo-chi's blow was not as painless for him as the guy thought because of his silence. Jungwoo-chi watched his actions without taking his eyes off him, while Kang Jin-hee continued to film from a distance. Coming to its senses, the monster began to gradually grow in size, which shocked the guy incredibly. He clearly did not expect such an advantage from his opponent. Having grown at least twice as large, the monster rushed towards the guy, running at the speed of light and raising his right hand to strike. Jungwoo-chi raised his arm to strike, preparing to hit the monster when it got close, but it rushed past without even looking at the guy standing in its way. Passing the guy, the giant rushed straight towards the girl who was filming everything, and the guy shouted her name with all his might. Realizing that he would not be able to outrun the monster and get to the girl before it did, Jungwoo-chi decided that he needed to tie it up and stop it. His eyes burned with fire as he stared intently at the monster, and after a moment, he noticed that it was also beginning to smoke in some places. Soon, the monster's entire body was engulfed in flames. It turned black and began to swell with bubbles. The guy thought the monster was boiling and about to explode, but the monster kept getting closer to the girl, its whole body really boiling. The guy mentally begged it to freeze and thought he was going crazy. When the monster was only a few meters away from the girl, it exploded with a deafening sound and turned into a cloud of foul-smelling liquid. Since she was standing close to the scene, some of the liquid spilled on her. The girl called out the guy's name and was about to faint. The guy was already close to her, and in a few jumps, he covered the distance between them and put out his hand to catch her. About to faint, Kang Jin-hee called out to Jungwoo-chi by name. So the guy caught her with one arm and, preventing her from falling, asked what was wrong. But he heard another voice. He looked up and saw a guy hovering a few meters above the roof, who asked how the monster had played into the box. Jungwoo-chi wanted to ask what he had done, but before he could finish, the guy replied that he was a good man on their side and asked if the producer was okay. Jungwoo-chi remembered that he was holding an unconscious girl in his arms and thought it was strange that she was heavy when he carried her on his shoulder, feeling her human weight. The guy took off his hood and smiled, saying he could control gravity. That was his ability. He had short golden hair and eyes of the same color. After what happened, Kang Jin-hee was sent to the hospital, where she underwent all the necessary tests to rule out internal injuries. While the girl was resting in the hospital ward, Yujin and Jungwoo-chi came to visit her. The girl reported that, according to the doctors, there were no obvious abnormalities. Yujina said that she could not have imagined that by cooperation, the guy meant involving civilians in their affairs. As always, the imperturbable Jungwoo-chi said that she was not a civilian, but a producer for his channel, and it was obvious that she was his assistant, which is why she was with him. But the girl did not back down, insisting that even the thought of dragging a civilian into a place where others had been injured was nonsense. After spending some time in the ward, they went outside, and the girl said that there was information that the guy had met Mr. Hachi. Jungwoo-chi asked who that was. The girl laughed and said that he probably didn't introduce himself. The guy guessed that it was the flying guy and asked why they let him in, since the case had been entrusted to him. Yujin took another drag and replied that initially, the guy was only supposed to break the barrier and get them out. He was a fan of Jungwoo-chi, who was quite surprised. Hearing this, he said he understood when ordinary people watched his broadcasts and videos and wrote comments to him, but he didn't understand why he needed it. The girl didn't answer. She remembered a conversation with the flying guy in his kitchen some time ago when he was watching Jung Woo-chi's broadcast. The guy then asked her what would happen if Chun Woo-chi's channel was suddenly shut down. The girl asked him to focus, saying that it was about his future. The guy refused, saying he didn't want to participate, but Yujin insisted, saying the situation was very dangerous and he had to go with her immediately. The guy disagreed, saying that he should send Chun Woo-chi the latest data on Iskid and that it wasn't too late, asking the girl to give it to him herself. Then he asked if she could give him Jung Woo-chi's phone number, but the girl refused, saying she had a question for him. She then continued, saying that there had been a recent increase in incidents of terror and disappearances, but that he was probably aware of this because he watched Jung Woo-chi's videos. Finally, she added that she was here on behalf of her boss, who had instructed her to bring the guy to them as soon as possible and not to return without him. After thinking for a moment, Haji asked if they had attacked Jung Woo-chi now and if he wasn't risking more than anyone else. She replied that the guy couldn't stand up for himself, that they didn't know the reasons for the disappearances or how they were happening. But Haji interrupted her and said, "Let them protect the guy." After thinking for a moment, he looked at her with his golden eyes and said he would only go if Jung Woo-chi was there too. The girl realized that she had been masterfully offered a choice without a choice, because she had to bring Haji, so she had to agree. Now, talking to Jung Woo-chi, Yujin informed him that, in connection with what had happened, it had been decided that he and Haji should live in Mr. Tangoon's residence. Jung Woo-chi's reaction was quite predictable. He became indignant and shouted, asking her who had decided this and why they had to obey. Yujin replied that they were offering the best security measures. The guy yelled that he didn't agree. No one had warned him that he would have to deal with a child. When he got home, Jung Woo-chi checked his blog and wrote a post, but he couldn't get more than 200 likes. However, a comment demanding an apology for the latest video received many likes, and the guy thought he would probably have to shoot a new video. Someone wrote that they were surprised that the guy suddenly decided to write posts, and Jung Woo-chi thought that the last video was a failure, and of course, he disappointed the viewers. However, he remembered the battle itself and said that this monster was much stronger than the previous ones. Plus, it got stronger during the battle. Not only that, but he also tried to harm the man with his actions, and he still didn't understand why viewers were unhappy. Then the guy put all these facts together, remembered that the monster had started to grow after losing, and thought about what he wanted to achieve. He lay on the floor, hoping that he would be able to think better there. Then, saw Merlin's business card on the edge of the table, and called him to suggest a meeting. They agreed to meet in the city. When the guy arrived, he saw a crowd gathered around Merlin, who was giving some kind of performance. He took a red rose from the bouquet of a girl standing in front of him and slowly covered the flower with his other hand, the audience watching his every move. When the flower was completely covered by his hand, the guy jerked his hand up and a red handkerchief appeared in his hand. He said the flower had disappeared. Vinny laughed and said he had made a mistake, but the girl shouldn't worry. He would return the flower to her and covered his hand with the red handkerchief. After that, he slowly counted from 1 to 3, then abruptly pulled the handkerchief up and a rose appeared in his hand. The audience went wild. However, the flower in his hand was pink, and Merlin said that if the girl didn't like the color, he could make it red. But she said the flower was beautiful. The girl was completely enchanted by Merlin. She asked him in awe how he did it, saying that it was the first time she had ever seen such a miracle. The boy replied that it was a trade secret. When he arrived at the scene, Jung Woo-chi did not immediately reveal his presence to Merlin. He watched his actions, enjoyed himself, and decided that he was very impressed. The guy heard the crowd discussing how he could have attached the cut bud. Someone suggested that he had replaced it with a flower prepared in advance. Suddenly, a girl standing next to Merlin with a bouquet of red roses cried out in surprise. Everyone looked at her and their eyes widened. Right before everyone's eyes, the red roses turned pink, and the girl looked at Merlin with admiration and asked how he did it, saying he was definitely not a wizard. A girl behind the crowd started shouting that the girl with the roses had embarrassed the guy and called her a cutie. Jung Woo-chi heard this and grinned. Merlin looked up and saw Jung Woo-chi in the crowd and answered the crowd's unspoken question that the girl was indeed cute and had embarrassed him. Then he stretched out his hand and said that his assistant was present. Everyone parted, and Merlin pointed to Jung Woo-chi. He refused, not wanting Merlin to take credit for his work, but stepped forward, and Merlin asked him to say hello, saying that he was popular on not to. A little girl standing nearby looked at Jung Woo-chi and asked if he was also a wizard. Merlin replied that he did not use magic, but was a famous Taoist. Listening, Jung Woo-chi heard someone say, "Wizards in the West, Taoists in the East." A girl said, "The outfit is so-so, but look at his face." Someone said, sarcastically, that he had decided to use word of mouth for his street performance, that he was a cowardly guy, and wondered why people reacted that way in real life. He was used to people reacting that way in comments and thought that in real life it would be different. But Even though it bothered him, he thought that at least it amused him. After Merlin announced that his assistant was present in the square next to him, more people began to gather in the square. Chang Wuqi decided he should perform in front of the people and asked Merlin what he should do. Merlin thought for a moment and replied that he could make a double, for example. In response, Zhang Wuqi gave him a dismissive look. He thought Merlin had gone mad, but then another thought came to mind. He looked at the girl standing near them and asked her what she would like to see that was interesting. The girl was surprised, but did not believe him and asked him to repeat himself. The boy said that wizards only change the color of flowers, but Taoists are a completely different matter. He asked her to tell him what she wanted, promising to do it. After his speech, Merlin asked if he was being too cruel, but Chun Wuqi retorted that if he didn't like it, he should become a Taoist, and they both laughed. More people gathered around them, and suddenly, the girl asked if the guy could disappear. He asked her if she wanted him to disappear in a flash. He said to the audience that the plan was that when they were covered with a cloth, they would disappear, and he asked if they understood, snapping his fingers. The audience took out their phones, ready to capture the trick. Someone in the crowd said it was the magic of disappearance. However, after a few moments, nothing had changed. Everyone was still there, the guy, Merlin, and the audience in the square. There was complete silence. Then, covering his mouth with his hand so that the audience couldn't hear their conversation, Zhang Wuqi whispered to Merlin about the cloth, asking where it was. Merlin snapped his fingers and a dome appeared above them. The guy asked how he could get things out of nowhere, and the magician replied that he had already surprised the people with a bouquet. They were covered by a colorful dome, only their feet sticking out. People began to talk about how this was possible, where it came from, and assumed that it had also been hidden somewhere. The dome began to rotate around them. The boy crouched down so that the girl could see him from under the dome, signaled her to be quiet, and said it was their secret. At that moment, he spread his magic scroll on the ground, which he used to travel anywhere, and he and Merlin stood on it. The dome held steady at first, standing upright, then began to inflate like a balloon. The spectators filmed it on their phones and cameras, unable to look away. The dome inflated until it exploded, and everyone saw that the guys had disappeared. Someone said that they had really disappeared from all sides, and there were cries of, "The Taoists are cool!" Meanwhile, Zhang Wuqi and Merlin fell into the magical space inside the scroll, and the guy asked the magician how he felt about being there. The magician took a couple of steps and said that it felt like there was no floor under his feet and no sensation of walking. Chang Wuqi thought that creating such a space was not so easy. Merlin continued, saying that he was standing firmly and his muscles were not tense, which was amazing. The boy thought that a child who had entered a playroom for the first time would be less joyful. After enjoying himself, Merlin asked where the boy would take him, and the boy smugly replied that he had yet to take the magician anywhere. The magician was not upset. He asked if he understood correctly that through this space, one could get to any place, and admitted that he had been looking forward to it. The boy replied that first, they would have to return to where they came from, or to his home, as it was only possible to change the exit point from home. The magician replied that he had heard that in order to go somewhere, you first had to return to the starting point, instead of moving chaotically. He asked if there were any other restrictions, and the magician replied that there were not. The magician became curious about what would happen to objects and living beings if they were placed here. He also asked how many people could be there at the same time, what the area and volume of the place were, whether the guy at the bottom of the river had opened it, and whether it was filled with water. He also asked what would happen if he used his abilities to rotate the piercing water. Chun Wuqi replied that there was no point in doing such nonsense. After listening to him, Merlin said that he seemed to have no idea what a valuable artifact he had in his hands, and that if he were in his place, he would conduct experiment after experiment. The guy replied that he didn't want to know the answers to all the questions the magician had just asked him, and that he wanted to get rid of the scroll before it brought him trouble. Hearing his words, Merlin said that he had once offered to buy the scroll from the guy instead of throwing it away, and that the offer was still valid. But after these words, the guy suddenly changed his expression and shouted that he would never, ever sell the scroll. Merlin listened calmly and said that in that case, the only way for him to get the scroll was to give the young man enough information about it. Smiling, he asked if it could be considered a good sign that the guy had called him first to find out about the scroll, and the guy replied that it was possible. Encouraged by his words, Merlin added that unlike humans, their time was fortunately unlimited. The young man was surprised by his words and asked if the magician enjoyed his long life, complaining that he himself sometimes found it tedious. The magician suddenly changed his expression and said that he meant something completely different from what the guy thought, and that a long life was not fun at all. Chun Wuqi did not fail to notice this radical change in the magician's mood and facial expression, which made the young man wonder what was wrong with the magician. He thought about the magician from the legend, perhaps referring to Merlin. Of course, he was still far from being an old man, but it seemed that he had also lived for many years. Merlin understood from Zhang Wuqi's pensive face that he had noticed the changes in his face, and said that he had changed completely unconsciously. Merlin remembered that the young man wanted to talk about failures, and Zhang Wuqi asked if it was true that the magician had not seen him before his success with the first monster. The young man's question made the magician think. He replied that he had never lied, and asked why the young man was asking him this question again. The guy thought for a second, and said that the last monster was completely different from the previous ones, stronger, more developed, and completely different from the previous ones. The mage said he had no answer to that question, as he had never seen monsters in their perfect form, and now he could only say one thing. The guy asked, "What exactly?" And the mage continued, saying that perhaps the guy had already noticed it himself, but monsters were created in their image. The guy imagined the last monster he had to fight, and said it was a hybrid of a fish and a human. The mage said it was an improvement of the monster that gave it the ability to stand on its feet. When the guy asked if he had cleaned up the battle site, he answered in the affirmative. He did it because the guy left them there. The magician got angry and asked if he was irresponsible, leaving them as they were because there were people responsible for that. The surprised mage asked if ordinary people were in charge of this, and wondered if the guy had thought about what they were going to do with the remains. Then he added that his faith in people was enviable, and asked if the guy had met him to protect people, which he confirmed. The magician admitted that it was difficult for him to understand the guy's motivation, but promised that as soon as he found out anything about the scroll or the monsters, he would definitely contact him. They parted ways, and Zhang Wuqi went home. He lay on the floor in his room, thinking that everything was transitory, and about what he could do to make things better. He conjured up little people out of water, and said that the first option, to meet with friends and pour out his soul, was rejected due to the lack of friends. The second option that came to mind was to get drunk and dance, but he also categorically rejected this option because he had no money. Then there was a third option, to stream, but he also rejected it because a lot of time had passed since the date he promised to go live. A phone call distracted him from his gloomy thoughts. He looked at the screen, but the number was not fully displayed, so the guy asked who it was. He picked up the phone, said hello, and heard a familiar voice on the other end that also greeted him. The call did not make him happy. It was Hachi calling to say that when he had rescued the guy last time, the producer had forgotten her equipment, and it was with him. He was happy to hear from Zhang Wuqi and really wanted to meet him, supposedly to return the equipment. And in a burst of inspiration, he called him the great broadcaster Zhang Wuqi. As much as Zhang Wuqi wanted to stay home and not meet Kang Haji, he still got ready and went to his house to get his equipment. The first thing he saw when he entered his apartment was the guy himself watching one of his streams. But that wasn't the only thing that caught his attention. He saw a huge shelf with videotapes of his broadcast. The tapes were arranged by year, and each shelf was labeled. One of his latest episodes was playing on a large TV, and Zhang Wuqi froze in surprise when he entered the room. Responding to his questioning look, the guy explained that his videos were constantly being broadcast here, and that the collection on the shelves had grown quite large in a short time. Zhang Wuqi was not only embarrassed by the fact that the guy was acting like a real fan of his, he didn't like it. So he reminded him that he had come for his equipment. Kang Haji asked him to wait a second, flew up into the air, and went to get the equipment. The guy asked if that meant he could control gravity. Still in the air, he replied that he did, and threw the bag containing the camera up into the air, making it hover. He said that he could control the force of gravity, not only of his own body, but also of other objects, and the bag flew through the air straight into Zhang Wuqi's hands. The guy was incredibly excited that the great broadcaster himself had come to visit him, and that he was able to show him his abilities. However, the young man's demonstration of his abilities confused Zhang Wuqi, and he had to think about what he had seen. He stood deep in thought, when suddenly, he felt something happening in the room, as if energy flows were pulling him in. At first, he did not understand what was happening, but then, when a notebook and pen flew through the air and hovered right in front of him, he realized what it was. By the time they appeared in front of him, Kang Haji smiled and asked ingratiatingly if he could get an autograph from the great broadcaster, but he barked no. The failed attempt to get an autograph did not embarrass the guy, and he asked if they could take a photo together. Zhang Wuqi replied that they were both guys, so what photos? He didn't have time to be upset by the guy's behavior, because his phone rang, and it turned out to be Merlin the magician calling. The guy thought he was very fast. The magician scheduled a meeting for now, and in order not to waste time, they left immediately and found themselves somewhere in the mountains illuminated by the full moon. Seeing that Zhang Wuqi had not come alone, the magician scratched his chin and said thoughtfully that he had not expected the guy to come with company. At that moment, Kang Haji and Zhang Wuqi were just coming out of the scroll, almost next to the place where the magician was waiting for them, and he asked who was with the guy. With a snap of his fingers, the scroll rolled up, and the boy replied that it was his fan. Seeing the magician's surprised look, he added that he was actually someone else, just saying he was a fan. Kang Haji bowed to the magician and introduced himself. He did not expect the broadcaster's visit to end this way. The magician asked what role the guy would play. At that moment, John Woo-chi handed the guy a bag with a camera and said he would be the cameraman. The guy asked if he would be responsible for filming the streams. Jung Woo-chi replied, "Who knows?" and added that the guy would follow him around and shoot videos, making sure that the magician didn't get in the frame. The magician became interested in the young man who had arrived with the Taoist and asked if his ability was really levitation. He replied that it wasn't quite like that. The magician said he didn't have to tell him and asked if his ability only applied to objects or to people as well. It turned out that it applied to people too. Merlin was delighted to hear the young man's answer and immediately decided that now was the time to test the young man's abilities. Suddenly, he jumped up. 3 others followed him into the air. Chung Woo-chi, his bag with a camera, and Kang Haji. They rose and froze. When the magician decided to descend to the ground, he realized that he was hanging against his will. He saw that everyone was hanging and said that he liked the young man's ability. After hanging there quietly with them for a while, the magician suddenly broke away and shot upward, and the guys immediately rushed to catch up with him. Chung Woo-chi said contemptuously that the magician was a disgusting person, but the guy, on the contrary, was delighted that he immediately recognized what his gift was. He had heard that the magician was a member of Ixid, whom he did not know, but thought he was amazing. Jung Woo-chi asked what he meant by talking about Ixid. They flew after the magician for quite a long time before arriving at their destination and landing. Kang Haji gasped in surprise and froze, looking around with wide eyes. The magician brought them to an unusual place. They were standing on a mountain, and in front of them stretched a huge area with a scattering of buildings. The magician said happily, "It looks much bigger than on the map. Almost like a whole village." Kang Haji replied admiringly, "You could build a golf course here." After waiting a while, they saw a huge bus arrive, from which some human-like figures began to emerge. After getting off the bus, the people fell to their knees on the ground and began to bow before the majestic building next to which they were standing. Jung Woo-chi asked if the production was real, and the magician replied that he had come to the same conclusion and said that the sect was called Kechon, he thought. Upon hearing where they had arrived, Jung Woo-chi was indignant. He had only heard about the sect from the old man and Yu Ji-na, and did not know that the magician was also interested in it. A drone was flying around the building, and someone reported that Mother Bear had arrived at 2345 with the service staff. It seemed that this was the final destination. The man who was operating the drone and monitoring the building called Yu Ji-na. She listened to everything and asked if he thought it was a base. At that moment, the man watched as the people who had arrived climbed the stairs and said it looked like it, but the security was weak, with only 1 checkpoint. The girl asked if he could check everything on site right now, and the man replied that it would be difficult without the help of the first team. He added that he would wait until the Mother Bear came out, and that they still needed help from the first team. Then, Yujin received a call from Jung Woo-chi. She picked up the phone, and the guy told her that the head of the sect called himself God, which meant that the Master of Heaven, the head of the sect, dictated the will of heaven. After finishing his conversation with Yujin, Merlin pointed out to Jung Woo-chi that there were no lights in some parts of the building. The guy looked and saw that it was true. In the middle of the building, there were windows carved into the walls in the shape of huge crosses, and there were indeed no lights on in them. Merlin said that it would be possible to enter this building using the scroll. The guy replied categorically no, and the magician asked why he was so adamant. The guy replied that not long ago, the magician had shared that he wanted to conduct crazy experiments with the scroll, and he would rather give it to Kang Haji. The magician did not remember the crazy experiments, and asked if Kang Haji could use the power again. He replied that he was not sure he could do it in one go. He began to make excuses, saying that he could adjust to the wind on his own, but now there were 3 of them, and it was unlikely to work. However, the magician reassured him that there was no need to worry. He took off his gloves, and with a slight movement of his hand, lifted them into the air, saying that there were many ways to fly. At the same time, in some completely unbelievable way, eagle heads appeared on both of his gloves, and a pair of wings were added to them. To say that the guys were surprised would be an understatement. Kang Haji was horrified and stared at the magician's gloves, his mouth wide open. Even though Jung Woo-chi had already encountered a mage, he was not prepared for such a turn of events either, so he grimaced. Having completed the transformation of the gloves, the mage laughed as if nothing had happened and narrowed his eyes, pleased with the effect he had had on the boys. Before they could look back, the gloves turned into huge birds. One of them grabbed Kang Haji by the arms, the other grabbed Jung Woo-chi, and they flew away. When they entered the building, Merlin said he had deliberately led them this way, But there was nothing unusual here, except for a room that looked like an armory. They entered the room, which, according to the magician, resembled an armory. Various weapons stood along the walls, and wooden boxes stood to the side. Further on, they found themselves on the stairs again. The magician said he smelled something suspicious coming from the ventilation pipe, and the basement impressed him. Khan Haji Shol was the last to descend the stairs. He was setting up his camera and preparing to film when he shouted that the missing people must be here. Merlin walked ahead, listening carefully to what the guy was saying. Hearing about the missing people, he turned over his shoulder and asked about them. Khan Haji realized he had said something he shouldn't have. He didn't know that the magician wasn't aware of the situation and looked at Jun Wuqi, who asked why he was staring at him. The magician realized that they were hiding something from him. He stopped, turned to the guys, and asked who was missing. The guys replied that they were the same as them, others. He closed his eyes and asked why he was only finding out about this now, to which he was told that he was safe and sound because this information could be dangerous for him. After listening to these arguments, the magician asked if they really wanted to say that they valued them, but then Jung Wuqi was distracted by his phone, which had received notifications. It was a message from Yu Jina, informing him that the cult's building had increased its capacity and that the group there would need their help. He reread the messages several times, told his companions about their contents, and wondered if they could join them. Merlin said it was a complete dead end when they went down to the floor below. Kang Haji replied that they couldn't get stuck in this building. Jun Wuqi remembered that the mage had mentioned a smell coming from the ventilation system and suggested going there. The mage replied that yes, they could indeed do that. His gait suddenly became lighter and smoother, and he joked that since they had a newcomer with them, they needed to find at least a piece of the monster. After a few flights of stairs, Merlin told them to stay put because the rest of the way could be dangerous. Jung Wuqi was indignant, asking why all of a sudden. The boys stood on the steps of the staircase, and the magician stood on the landing, where he found himself on a hatch from which light was streaming. The guys froze. Kang Haji's face was frozen in surprise and interest, while Jun Wuqi's face expressed indignation, complaint, and question. Suddenly, the hatch under the mage disappeared. He said that the suggestion to go through the ventilation shaft was good, but the path through it did not inspire him with enthusiasm. While he was saying all this, he hung over the open hatch, then slowly began to descend into it, shouting to the guys to follow him carefully. They immediately rushed down the steps to catch up with him. Jun Wuqi still looked indignant, and Kam Haji looked surprised by everything around him. He shouted at the mage, who didn't want to crawl through the ventilation system, and made a hole himself. He sent a message to Yujin that they wouldn't be able to help the others in the group. Jung Wuqi thought for a moment, then boldly stepped into the hatch and flew down, already feeling his nose sting from the unpleasant smell. Kang Haji followed him. When they landed and looked around, they saw the source of the unpleasant smell, a pile of monsters by the wall. When they left the room, the mage said he had seen places like this before, something like landfills. Jung Wuqi asked if he had seen them in the laboratories where he cleaned. The mage was struck by the sarcasm in the guy's words. He turned around and said that until you make a mistake, you cannot truly live, or you will die when you do. Kong Jin made the camera film itself. The mage said that these monsters couldn't be thrown out onto the street or burned, so they were hidden away, and there was no need to bother with each one. They had just come to the floor plan of the building, and the mage said that judging by the well-made ventilation, the building had been carefully planned. After studying the floor plan, Jung Wuqi counted 3 laboratories, an inspection room, a demonstration hall, and a raw materials warehouse, and wondered what they were storing there. Suddenly, out of nowhere, Merlin started running, and the guys ran after him, asking what the monsters were made of. The mage replied that they were made in their image. He asked if the guys had already guessed what the monsters were made of. Jung Wuqi suddenly realized that they were needed to create the monsters, namely, other people. The mage stopped, turned to them, and said he thought they had already noticed what the monsters were made of after what they had seen in the basement. Merlin replied that there had been a misunderstanding, that others were very similar in nature to humans, and the guy understood what he meant by in our image. He shouted, asking why the mage was only mentioning this now. The mage replied that he had not lied to them, but had himself been uncertain until he saw the landfill. Jung Wuqi got angry and shouted that if the mage had known about this and told them, they would have spent less time if only he could have known where the others had gone. The magician replied in the same tone that he himself had also hidden information from him, and if he had been told about the missing people, he might have acted differently. As they ran and sorted things out along the way, they reached a door with a sign that said, "Restricted area, no trespassing." Jung Wuqi touched the door and said that since it was a raw materials warehouse, it was possible that the missing people were there. The mage suggested that anything was possible. Kang Jin was the last to reach the door and was standing there trying to catch his breath when Jung Wuqi suddenly grabbed his wrist and pulled him painfully toward him. The next moment, the mage saw that the space of the scroll had opened. Zhang Wuqi pushed Kang Haji into it, and in another moment, they both disappeared. Finally, Zhang Wuqi snapped his fingers, and the scroll rolled up and disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Merlin remained standing alone in front of the door. At that moment, the boys were transported to Zhang Wuqi's room. Kang Haji found himself on all fours on the floor. Zhang Wuqi told him to stay there. He was about to leave when the boys suddenly grabbed his arm and begged him to let him go with them to the Forbidden Zone. But Zhang Wuqi was adamant, saying that this time, the guy would see the bodies of people, not monsters, and the guy's eyes widened in horror. However, despite this prospect, he still held Zhang Wuqi's hand and, bowing his head in resignation, begged him not to leave him at home, but to take him with them. Leaving the boy safe in his apartment, Zhang Wuqi returned, and when he and the magician entered the warehouse, they saw a man chained to a table. Electrodes were attached to his body. The guy recognized him as the missing Che Wudo. Merlin said that the guy seemed to know him, and that he sympathized with him. Merlin took a notebook from the table, opened it, and began to read. He said they were studying what needed to be removed for application and how long the recovery would take. Zhang Wuqi lamented that the guy had more experience than him and wondered how he could have been caught. Merlin suggested that his opponents could have worked together to neutralize him. Out of anger and helplessness, Zhang Wuqi began to clench his fists. He said that the mage could have shared the information with him if he had any suspicions. The mage replied that he couldn't do that because he had no guarantee that the guy himself wasn't a member of that organization. Hearing this, Zhang Wuqi flew into a rage, veins bulging in his fist, wondering how the magician could even suggest such a thing about him. Merlin sat in his chair, studying the information in his notebook, and came to the conclusion that, apart from the gentleman lying here, an incredible number of experiments had been carried out. And the worst part was that the results made absolutely no sense. The notebook said that all the test subjects had been discarded. Zhang Wuqi remembered the room in the basement where they had found the pile of monster bodies and was horrified by the scale of the experiments and the number of victims. After studying the records, Merlin put down the notebook and said that as of December last year, only one test subject remained, the one who was now lying here. Zhang Wuqi rushed to remove the electrodes connected to Che Wudu and said that the guy needed to be taken to the hospital as soon as possible. That was the first thing they needed to do. While he was doing this, the guy lying on the table suddenly came to and growled. Merlin said that if he were in the guy's place, he would have killed the man. Zhang Wuqi looked at him in confusion and asked what he was talking about. The magician replied that it might be better to give the man a peaceful and quick death. No sooner had he finished speaking than he found himself surrounded on all sides by icy daggers. While voicing his proposal, Zhang Wuqi uttered a spell. The mage calmly replied that if they let the man go, they would be pursued. He did not know what the man was capable of, but danger would follow them everywhere. He touched the dagger, and Zhang Wuqi wondered why he didn't freeze when the guy asked why the mage asked if he had seen even one fugitive. The guy replied that they had no information, but if the mage decided to do something stupid, he would deal with them in an instant. Merlin raised his hands in a gesture of reconciliation and said that the guy should decide for himself, because when it comes to acquaintances, it is always difficult to make balanced decisions. The guy rudely asked him to shut up, took the ice sword himself, and began to use it to break the locks that bound his comrade. There were many of them, all made of iron and soldered to the surface of the table. Their strength was designed to restrain an enraged monster. However, the guy tried to cut through the metal of the locks with his ice sword, and it seemed to be working. While he was cutting one of the locks, something unimaginable happened. They suddenly broke away from the table, rose into the air, and hovered behind the guy. The man lying on the table remained unconscious, but now his body lay freely, unchained, and nothing held him back. A moment later, the locks fell to the floor, and Zhang Wuqi began swearing, asking what kind of nonsense they had hung on his friend. He was about to bend down to pick one up and look at it when Merlin asked if he could take a look, but the guy refused with a glance. The mage said that now this man was none of his concern, that all responsibility lay with the guy, but that he was obviously more knowledgeable than the guy when it came to analysis. Then they noticed that the locks lying on the floor, which had recently chained the man to the table, were slowly melting on their own. One by one, the locks and chains melted and turned into a puddle of metal spread across the floor. It happened in a matter of seconds. Merlin picked up a few fragments from the floor, examined them, and said that they reacted strongly to his power, which meant that they were not artifacts. He would call them living fragments. The fragments flew up, and the mage said they could use part of themselves as a separate tool, similar to the guy's ability to create a double. With a wave of his hand, the particles exploded and turned into powder. The mage collected them in a bag and said that the particles were definitely alive, which the guy himself must have noticed. The man on the table was still motionless when Zhang Wuqi asked if the mage really thought that those who had organized all this would come after them. The magician looked at the unconscious man and replied that it wasn't that important. He was more interested in whether Che Wudu was okay. No sooner had he said this than the man lying on the table seemed to come to his senses, began to move, and cough. Delighted, Zhang Wuqi immediately rushed to the table and, leaning over the man, said that he was Zhang Wuqi and asked if he recognized him. The man on the table suddenly opened his eyes. They were completely red and had no pupils, his eyebrows furrowed, and Zhang Wuqi called his name in surprise. Merlin just spread his arms, his gaze and his whole posture seeming to indicate that he had warned the young man from the very beginning about the consequences. Suddenly, there was an explosion and a flash of bright light. Zhang Wuqi even had to cover his eyes with his hand so that it wouldn't blind him. Liquid fire poured in from all sides. Zhang Wuqi found himself under a protective dome. He said things similar to Chauvin's style and asked about escape. He tried to get out of the room, moving under the protective dome of water, but told himself that everything was on fire and he would not be able to get out. He unfolded the scroll, looked around, asked if the magician had survived, and answered himself that if he hadn't, he would pray for him, and stepped into the space of the scroll. There was a snap of his fingers, the scroll rolled up, and a moment later disappeared as if it had never been there, while streams of liquid fire continued to fill the room. As soon as he returned to his room, sticking his head out of the scroll, he saw Yujin and yelled at her, asking what she was doing in his house. Pulling himself out completely, he looks around angrily at the girl and asked her if she had done it. She narrowed her eyes and replied that she had not. Walking around the apartment, she told him that while Mr. Hachi was here, he had managed to clean up the apartment, which was indeed sparkling. Disappointed, Zhang Wuqi replied that he was not in the mood for that, but she said she wanted him to accept the offer of cooperation from the special task force. Hearing this, the guy remembered the flash and how quickly the liquid fire spread through the room, and asked if the people from the departments were still there. The girl replied that there were no reports of evacuation yet, only people in the second team, so normal surveillance would be helpful. At that moment, Zhang Wuqi entered the restroom and, seeing Kang Haji cleaning his toilet, grabbed him by the hood and silently dragged him along. Running, unrolling the scroll, and dragging the boy behind him, the guy shouted to Yujin that he had no time right now and would talk to her another time. Meanwhile, a fire broke out in the cult's lair, and screams of "Fire! Help! Save us!" could be heard from other rooms. Che Wudu had already come to his senses and got up from the table. He was terribly angry, growling and shifting from foot to foot, stretching his muscles. He remembered the blurred face of the man he had seen constantly for a long time when he briefly regained consciousness while lying on this table. This image caused an even greater surge of anger and rage. The man jumped up, growled, clenched his fists, and was ready to rush out and tear everyone in his path to pieces. Soon, the entire building was engulfed in flames. People were trapped and unable to get out, so they screamed and begged for help. As Zhang Wuqi and Kang Haji flew toward the cult's lair, Zhang Wuqi told the young man that they would have to fall from the height at which they were flying, faster than birds. There had been a lot going on that day. First, they refused to take him in for surgery, and now they had accepted him, but he had to fall. He asked why. The Taoist explained that if the guy saw everything from above, he would better understand what was going on, and asked if he could make them fly when they got there. They flew. Kang Haji replied that he could, and asked when to start. The Taoist replied that when they started falling, he didn't know what would happen if he started casting spells here. The guy said okay, and got ready, and just in time, because they had almost finished their flight. Zhang Wuqi told him to get ready. As soon as they jumped out of the scroll, they froze in the air and then flew, and the guy pointed in the direction of the burning building. Zhang Wuqi, descending smoothly, said that he could see it himself and that when the guy landed, he should immediately contact Yujin. He himself flew to the burning building and said that Kang Haji would work with the second special task force there, so there was no need to fight. Flying further, he asked if the guy could handle it, and the guy replied that of course he could, and asked why Zhang Wuqi wasn't going with. Approaching the building, Zhang Wuqi replied that he needed to sort things out here. Kang Haji shouted how he was going to manage alone, but he did not answer. He saw a man making his way through the fire, already engulfed in flames, and thought that it was urgent to pour water on everything here. Continuing to fly and looking at the burning building below, Zhang Wuqi thought about it and felt as if he had returned to the past, several centuries ago. He saw two guys watching the burning village, and one of them told the other to look at the results of his recklessness. He remembered the disappointed, guilty, and helpless look on the face of the guy to whom these words were addressed, and it hurt him. Memories flooded him like a stream of water, but he shook them off, returned to the present, and told himself that this time he would not run away. A few minutes later, he approached the ground and prepared to jump. Kang Haji shouted something else at him, but the guy couldn't hear him anymore. Touching the ground, he waved his hand and conjured up water, saying that after 500 years, he deserved a peaceful life and would now do things his own way. At that moment, the Special Forces team ran towards the burning building, calling out to the guy who had broken away from the group. They tried to stop him, saying that he was heading for certain death, but he, wearing only a bulletproof vest, was going to break into the burning building. His comrades, rushing after him, discussed how they had disliked him since the previous operation, but now he seemed to have gone completely mad. The guy running ahead decided to use the spikes on the soles of his shoes and, shouting, he jumped so high that he reached the roof. His comrades rushed after him and also jumped onto the roof. Some of them didn't even know that their equipment could be used in this way. The guys asked the commander what to do and what orders they would receive. He looked at the fire burning everywhere and closed his eyes for a second. Suddenly opening his eyes, he and his team saw that the pillar of fire bursting into the sky was surrounded on all sides by icy cliffs. From the side, it seemed as if the ice was absorbing the fire, as if the icy rocks had begun to grow upward and cover the fire from all sides, enclosing it in a dome. This continued until the powerful pillar of fire was completely covered with an icy crust, turning into a huge ice mountain. The people on the territory lay and crawled on the ground. Someone looked at the fire and said with resignation that they would all meet their doom here. Suddenly, the man who said this heard a voice telling him not to rush to give up. A guy in a tracksuit appeared, his hands in his pockets. It was John Woo Chi. He looked around. People were still on the ground, some lying down, some sitting, and he asked if their legs were broken. The answer was silence. So he asked if there were any people here who were unable to walk, and if so, he would walk slowly and they should follow him. After his words, people began to get up from the ground. He walked slowly, as he had promised, and they followed him, constantly looking around. There were so many people that the guy had to make several copies of himself, each accompanying a separate group and telling them where to go carefully. Kang Haji contacted Yujin, who reported that the second group had lost contact and that if the situation became dangerous, they should evacuate immediately. The girl didn't have time to finish her sentence before the call dropped. Kang Haji looked at his phone and saw that there was no signal in the area, and he said sadly, "It's broken." People were running around him or still sitting on the ground. Ash was flying, and he stood there thinking about how he would find the second group in such conditions and without communication. Suddenly, the guy heard a voice behind him. He didn't know who it was, but it was Kang Haji. The voice sounded familiar, and the guy turned around. He saw Merlin and said he was glad the mage was safe. Merlin replied that he was sure that Junwuchi had taken him to a safe place, but it was not safe here. The guy was in no mood for conversation about the second group. Merlin decided that he was nervous and asked why he was afraid, since he seemed to treat the guy well. The guy replied that he wasn't afraid. Merlin said that the guy was without his guardian and that this could cause problems, and offered to take him to him. Kang Haji raised his hands in front of him, showing that he didn't need help, and his guardian told him not to interfere. Merlin replied that he completely agreed. Looking at the icy mountain, the guy asked why. Merlin replied that the guardian was trying to stop the fugitive, and that it would be difficult for him to protect him at the same time. After these words, Kang Haji became noticeably sad and said that now he understood what Junwuchi meant when he told him to stay away from here. Merlin noticed the guy's reaction and asked him if it was just his impression or if it was really the case, but he got the impression that the guy's pride had been hurt. After thinking for a moment, the young man replied sadly that his abilities were only enough to make himself and other objects fly. However, the magician countered that this was not entirely true, that gravity was a powerful weapon that could not be countered, and that it all depended on how it was used. It seemed that his words had opened up a whole new universe for the guy. He looked at the mage with surprised eyes, and the mage asked if no one had ever taught him this before.